Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And if you're like me and you grew up watching the Star Wars films, we used to have to wait for films to come out. It wasn't like this Disney World where there's a new Star Wars thing coming every, few weeks. You had to wait years. Well, it seems we've had to wait a long time for part three of this discussion. It has been quite a while between parts one and two and three, but we have finally got to part three of our look at US military crime. And I'm going to bring in our guest, Mark Turner, in a moment. But before I do, as I've been saying on all the shows recently, just a quick reminder, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, click the little bell so you get the notifications. Comment in the sidebar when we're chatting, and also leave a nice comment afterwards. It all really does, I promise you, help with the YouTube algorithm to bring this channel up and get more viewers in. Since the situation in Ukraine, viewing numbers have dropped a little bit. It's happening across the board with podcasts, things like that. So just to keep us ahead above water, just do those little things for me. You'll be really helping. Cheers. Thank you. That's good. So, and this is our last show before I have a break, and our next show after today. So don't worry, there's nothing happening. The next show will be on April the 8th, and that'll be an amazing one because we have a US World War II veteran joining us, along with Kevin Mara, to talk about the new book that you can read about in the YouTube description. But again, I'm not going to flannel on. We're going to bring Mark Turner in to carry on part three. So good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. So we're going to get straight into it because those of people who've watched part one and part two, we went through how we sourced the data. We went through the processes you use to draw some of these conclusions. And so if people want to go back, they can watch that again. So I'm going to fire up the PowerPoint straight away, and you have to do your little caveat at the beginning. So I'll let you do that.
Yes, the little caveat. Yeah. So hello, everybody. It's great to be back with you again, Paul, and with all of your viewers. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on the globe right now. But yeah. So again, I'm Assistant Professor Mark Turner. Day job is to work at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff School. And as the slide indicates, although I am a Department of the Army employee, everything that we discuss here, in my opinions, aren't necessarily representative of the official position of the Army or the Department of Defense. So we got that out of the way, Paul.
We're done. We can move in. And just, by the way, since, of course, you last spoke to us, we had Paul Johnson on talking about the crimes, the murderers that are now honored sort of in a weird way on that Brookwood Memorial. So crime has come up again on the show, and it was a very popular show, that one. I think it proves that people are interested in this aspect of the past, because it kind of brings in that fascination the world has with, capital crimes and also the military. So it's a popular subject, if that's not an odd use of the word popular. But anyway, I'll hand it over to you, and folks, we'll just jump in with commenting as we go along. But I'll hand over to Mark, and we'll carry on from where we left off last time.
All right, sounds great. And again, just as a friendly reminder, so I am not a legal scholar, criminologist, psychologist, or psychiatrist. I just am somebody who's got this deep and never-ending sort of fascination, I guess, as many of you do as well, right? With the Second World War going on, I guess, most of my life now, right? Like you, Paul. Yeah. So I am a researcher, maybe someday a historian, but yeah, I mean, I do hope. If there are questions that get into sort of legal specifics, I'll do the best I can to answer. But I do hope that the research you'll find in this presentation is rewarding and interesting and practical as well, right? So it's not just something that is trivia that you can use at the bar or the pub or something, but it's actually meaningful and useful to you. So again, we have our key goals slide here. So probably don't need to say too much about this, just aside from the fact that again, this is nothing that I'm doing with these presentations. And thank you so much, Paul, for having me on to do all these. None of this is sort of a mass, indictment of the generations that were involved in the Second World War. Thankfully, we're talking about a fairly small segment of the various populations. Of course, I'm looking at U.S. specifically, but again, I'd say it's something that doesn't get covered very often. And I think if we want a fuller, richer, and some people may not want a more complicated picture of history of World War II. That really is reality. So I hope that we can do some of that today. And yeah, I think that pretty much should do it there for the piece there with key goals. So yeah, moving on. We finally made our way through all the statistics. Provided that overview back in part 1, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't seen it to go back and take a look. And then, of course, we tackled the first segment of murder and manslaughter in part 2. That was primarily focused upon Allied victims, neutral victims, civilians, individuals of that nature. And today is principally about victims who were military personnel, enemy military personnel. Pardon me. To be more specific. And then, of course, assuming that I don't continue to sort of stutter over myself here, if I do get invited back in the future, then perhaps we can get into some of these other topics like the sexually related crimes, desertion or cowardice, the various topics that you see here on the agenda further on. So what I am going to do, though, today, Paul, with your permission, is to spend just a little bit of time looking into some more quantitative research that I've done. And, once we get that out of the way, then we can dive into a number of specific examples that I hope, again, are going to help to sort of humanize, this topic. And again, provide you with, with memorable and powerful illustrations of U.S. military crime in War II. Okay. Yeah. So here we are. Everybody likes the numbers. Yeah. So the reason why I've built this slide and the next slide really is an acknowledgement that we did talk about gender from a quantitative standpoint back in part 1, and also addressed it as well in part 2, looking at specific victims. But I don't really think that I did really sort of enough really to delve into and address race. So we did look at some examples, talked about, for instance, the Ghana race riot that took place on the Ghana Guam in 1944. Talked a little bit about some other examples of sort of racially motivated violence. So there was the Battle for Bamber Bridge, Townsville Mutiny, the Port Chicago disaster, the Freeman Field Mutiny. Kind of the list just, unfortunately, the list just kind of goes on and on. But what I thought might also be helpful would be to zoom back out and to look at this from more of a macro perspective. So that's what I've done here, is to build a couple of charts that I hope, again, provide a more fuller picture of what was happening with regard to race and crime during the Second World War period. So what I've done here on this chart, the left-hand side of the chart is, I think, and you, for those of you who've watched the previous presentations, you basically know the structure of the slides now. So left-hand side of the chart tends to be either a primary source or sources or a secondary source. Yeah. So what we have here are census records, okay, which basically lay out prisoners in both state and federal prisons and reformatories, and it's broken out by age, sex, race, gender, a number of different categories. So if we then walk that over to the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see where the numbers lie. So if we do a white and a non-white, crime comparison, basically all, as it indicates, are non-whites, right? So this could be African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, the list kind of goes on there, but anybody who's not considered white. Basically comparing these crime statistics, again, these individuals that are going to be in civilian prisons, pretty revealing, I think, statistics come out of this. So we see that we have 71% of the prison population in 1941 is comprised of whites. And then in the same year, for non-whites, it is 29%. Okay, then moving on from there, fast forward to 1945, and I think it's safe to do that because the percentages remain fairly consistent, throughout the war years from 41 to 45. So we can see that there isn't a great deal of movement by 45. So at that point, whites that are in civilian prisons, incarcerated in state, federal institutions in 45, it's dropped a little bit to 68% of the overall prison population. And then our non-white population has come up just a tad bit to 32%. Now, what I've done also here is to look at those numbers relative to the population overall. So in the U.S., we do censuses every 10 years. The last census before we get involved in the war, at least sort of in a belligerent fashion, 41, the last census is 1940. So you can see that actually whites comprise 89.8% of the population in 1940. So at least if you're just looking at the numbers, I think perhaps this would imply a little bit of overrepresentation, perhaps, amongst non-white communities in the prison populations. And more on that here just in a moment. And then we move down from there to a pretty commonly referenced report that was done. You can see it comes out of a periodical called Federal Probation, published in the spring of 1946. And the actual title of the report, or pardon me, the article is a statistical study of 24,000 military prisoners. And so this is kind of interesting too. So when we compare and contrast Army and Army Air Forces prisoners with civilian prisons, I think we see kind of some interesting dichotomies here in the numbers. So what we find is that for white prisoners who are members of either the Army or the Army Air Forces, they make up 80.6% of the overall population who, again, is incarcerated while still in uniform. So they are general, prisoners. And then the non-white population, again, for Army and Army Air Forces, is at 19.4%. Okay, and then of course overall, and we find that the total number of Army and Army Air Forces personnel that are white, and this is pretty much consistent throughout the war, is going to be 89%. So essentially, that tracks, or that is consistent with what we see in the 1940 census as well. But what at least jumps out to me, and Paul, please feel free to chime in here, and of course any of the viewers as well, with your thoughts on this. But one thing that really stands out to me is it would seem, at least on its face, that perhaps the military justice system appears to be a bit fairer. If that's a sort of a decent statement to make. I mean, again, I think if you look at the civilian numbers to the military numbers, we do see a fairly significant drop, basically, in non-white prisoners who are in the Army or the Army Air Forces. So I think, perhaps that might represent it as an example, as these, well, of course, they aren't prisoners at the time, but as they're going through the military justice system, that perhaps, we've got court-martials that might be comprised of individuals from different regions of the country. And I'm not sort of going to, go to the maybe to the obvious stereotypes about particular regions of the country, but perhaps it's a little bit more equitable because you've got individuals coming in, perhaps with a little less bias, when they're actually going about, conviction and then of course sentencing as well. So I think that's a number that really stands out when you compare and contrast the two, their civilian population and the Army and Army Air Forces prisoner populations. One thing I want to add to this as well, because again, we can basically use numbers to say just about anything. I'm sure you've heard that cliche before. What I also wanted to share with today, I'm just going to read this verbatim. So this actually comes out of a report that was done in 1945. It's called, the actual title is Prisoners in State and Federal Prisons and Reformatories, 1945. And this was produced by the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of the Census. So this is what it says verbatim about perhaps looking maybe a little bit more deeply at perhaps these schisms that we see in sort of racial diversity and proportionality with these prison populations. And forgive me, just kind of upfront to let you know, I will use a word that it was in popular or was in use at the time. It's not sort of the word maybe you're thinking of. I will not use that word ever. But it is a kind of a similar word. So let me go ahead and just read this to you. Basically, the Department of Commerce concludes in this report that no definite conclusions regarding the relative criminality of Negroes and whites can be drawn from statistics of prison commitments. And this is when it gets pretty interesting as we move on in the remaining text. Prison statistics do not necessarily reflect the proportionate number of crimes committed by the two races or the number of arrests made. Crime statistics indicate that in general, Negro offenders are more likely to be arrested by the police than are white offenders. And then it concludes by saying, moreover, an unqualified comparison of white and Negro crime rates is not entirely justifiable because of differences in economic and educational status. So I think that's something really worth considering, right? We sort of see the output or the result of the judicial process, civilian or military, right? But it doesn't really speak to exactly how many individuals are being arrested to begin with, right? And then how many of those are actually being sentenced. And then when we actually get into conviction, conviction and then sentencing, this is what we see here doesn't necessarily reflect the actual length of sentences as well. And I didn't add it here, but I think you would go back and find that actually and this is a very, very broad statement, but typically we'll find that non-whites tend to be sentenced for longer periods of time than whites as well. So again, I don't think the numbers give kind of the entire picture, but I do hope, again, me reading out of that report provides a little bit more context and nuance, I think, to what we
It
see going
does,
forward.
and it's already challenging some of my perceptions a little bit. I mean, as you said, I think when we get to the sentencing, that would reflect a bit more of a prevalent situation of racism and bias there. But I think these statistics on screen now shows that inherently the military isn't necessarily a worse place, and probably and largely a better place than civilian life. And I suppose while I've been talking, it's that sense of teamwork, isn't it? We all know the stories of the Virginia guy who ends up with a New Yorker, and there's a Virginia, Ohio farmer, and so and so, and they're thrust into a situation. I know there was segregation and what have you, but the army is still. There's a sense of everybody mucking in together, which maybe is allowing for a appreciation of people's differences, possibly better than the civilian world, possibly.
Yeah, well, I think also we find more structure, we find more discipline, regimentation, and then as well, and I'd have to go back and double check this, but to my knowledge off the top of my head, I should have checked this beforehand. I mean, so it's equitable in terms of pay, right? I mean, so if you're a private, it doesn't really matter, what your skin color is or your ethnicity, you're all making the same amount of money. So I think also perhaps it helps to ameliorate some of what I referred to before in that statement from that Commerce report, where it talks about these variations in economic and educational status. So maybe that also tends to maybe drive the numbers down a bit. So yeah, I think there's a bit of a good news story there. Actually, the next slide is I think is actually the reverse.
I was just looking at that in advance, and I realized that's taking it the other way, isn't it? But,
it is definitely taking it the other way. Absolutely. In fact, we see that those percentages almost. I mean, it's not sort of the complete inversion, but it's pretty close to it. So what I'm showing here again, I'm just using census records and whatnot. So here they actually break it out by decade for executions, and there are some federal executions that are taking place at the time, but the numbers are so small that I wanted to just go with state executions instead. So we've got the last year that's available, before the war commences. Again, if you were to look at the chart there, the next sort of column covers 1950. So yeah, we see the exact opposite, right? So now we've gone from 71% of the prison population is white, 29% non-white. The numbers almost completely flip on the executions in 1940. So now we see that 37% of the state executions are white and 63% are non-white. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, again, not a criminologist. You could probably write books and multiple PhD dissertations trying to explain, why that is. But one thing I think is interesting, and I don't sort of want to go beyond sort of the temporal bounds or scope of why we're here, which is to talk about World War II. But to briefly digress maybe for just a second, if you were to look at this chart, it's I guess like the fourth sort of element down where it's looking at, the non-white numbers, tracking across decades. What's really interesting as well, and again, there probably have been books written about this already, but it's amazing how the percentage of non-whites goes up over time. And so trying to look at sort of a larger view of the screen here, I think in 1890, it's in the 20% range for non-whites. And then it increases steadily from 1890 all the way to 1940. And actually 1940 is the very pinnacle in terms of proportion of state executions of non-whites. Once we hit 1950, the numbers begin to drop. And then, of course, once we start getting into the latter part of the 20th century with the death penalty kind of coming off the books in multiple states, obviously the numbers drop way down. So it's fascinating. And I, again, find out the place to talk about, so why do the non-white numbers increase from the 20th percentile range all the way up to this very peak of the 60s, in World War II, and then drop down. So anyway, so if that weren't sort of, well, I guess an editorial comment bad enough, then we get into military executions, and it's actually even more pronounced there. So I'm consulting primarily a book here called The Fifth Field, really fantastic if you're just wanting to look at individuals who were executed. that had served in either the European theater, Mediterranean theater, or the North African theater. So that's what these numbers here represent, all those executions between 43 and 45. And we can see here that it's even more pronounced. Okay, so out of those 96 individuals that are going to be executed in one of those three theaters of operation, we see that the white numbers drop even further. They're now down to 17.7%. And the non-white numbers, I don't sort of want to speak sort of in hyperbolic terms, but I mean, well, skyrocketing probably is too strong a term to use, but they do jump significantly, right? 78.3%. So that really, I think, stands out there. And then moving from there, I wanted to go in and look a little bit at the two African-American divisions. As many of you know, there actually is one additional division. It's a 2nd Cavalry Division, which is deactivated, as I recall, in North Africa in 1944. So these are the only two divisions that are actually going to see combat. Of course, 92nd in the Mediterranean theater, and 93rd in the Asiatic Pacific theater. So again, this really stands out to me. Not so much the difference in numbers between the two African-American divisions there. Although I will say what is kind of interesting here is that the 92nd is only overseas for a little bit more than a year, from September 44 to I think November 45. 93rd goes over in the early part of 44, comes home in January 46. So it's almost twice as long that the 93rd is over there in theater, but it's a much different environment, right? I mean, the 93rd are on islands like, Biak and Bougainville and Guadalcanal. They finally the division kind of comes together in July of 45 in the Philippines in a number of locations, Zamboanga, Mindanao, some other locations. But so it isn't this sort of the same environment, I think within which individuals can commit crimes. And of course, I'm thinking of things here like rape would be, I think, probably a pretty good example there. But with all that said, I still think that the numbers for the 92nd just really stand out in very stark contrast to every other infantry division in the war. And in fact, just to give you some other data points here. So I was going back and digging into those border review records. So again, 92nd ID is going to execute 11 individuals altogether, primarily for murder overall. But having said that, I went back and I pulled actually all of the other infantry divisions where there'll be individuals sentenced for murder. I found 5 altogether, 1 from 3rd ID, 1 from the 82nd Airborne, 1 from the 45th ID, 2 from the 91st. They're all convicted of murder, and not a single one of those 5 individuals gets a death sentence. None of them. They all get life in prison or some other sentence. So that kind of stands out. When we just look within the theater itself, that I think stands out. Is fairly significant. And then on top of that, at the very bottom, and I know for the audience it may be a little bit difficult to read, but I went back again to those really cool the ETO Adjutant General, or pardon me, Judge Advocate General. Sorry, I'm thinking G1 versus JAG there. Sorry, records, and so this I think also really calls into question sort of how fair the system was. So I've got these red bordered boxes along the top. The one that's running sort of left to right there, or I guess we west to east. That reflects all the infantry divisions, and what that shows is that there will be 129 individuals that are actually going to receive a death sentence, and that's for all 46 infantry divisions that are in the ETO between July of 42 and October 45. 129 again will receive a death sentence. But what's very, very interesting about that is of those 129, only 9 are going to have their death sentences approved. The vast majority of the remainder, I think it's 90, are going to have their death sentences commuted to life imprisonment. So again, I think that really stands. I mean, the fact that we've got one single infantry division that executes more individuals than all of the infantry divisions combined over a 3+ year period in the ETO really, to me, stands out. So I don't know, Paul, if you have any thoughts about that. You're probably thinking deeper thoughts than I am, but anyway.
Well, I'm doing. It's without derailing the conversation. It's again, I'd love to see the data that probably doesn't exist about what constitutes bringing a case to trial, because as you're going to get into this idea of it being of enemy soldiers, or what. I can't think that bodies of men in combat are experiencing having different situations based on their color. So it suggests that I'm assuming that the 92nd is just pushing more of these cases for whatever reason. And take the 3rd USID, for example. I mean, they get through every theater. There are lots of opportunities, lots of the south of France, Italy, over that length of time. I don't know. It's interesting. We're seeing some incredible data here, but I feel there's more data behind it that we'll never have.
Well, some young aspiring PhD student needs to do a dissertation. I'm being a little bit flippant about that, but no, I think it would be really interesting to try to go back, and try to again get a deeper, sort of richer explanation as to why this happens. I do know that, I mean, there have been books written about the 92nd. Their commanding general is, as I recall, it's Ned Almond, who actually is a VMI grad, and he actually is a colleague, probably isn't the right word to use, but because George Marshall is also a VMI grad, right? General George Catlett Marshall, there's a connection there. And Marshall, at least from my readings, actually has pretty high expectations for Almond during the war. And of course, it doesn't quite work out that way with the 92nd. And it's of course, you could probably do one or multiple shows just on the 92nd's experience in the Mediterranean. But what I have read is that Almond tended to sort of push responsibility or culpability for any failures of the division off on others, and not sort of take those responsibilities on as the division commander, right, for the 92nd. So I'm sure that's also playing a role as well. But it is interesting that this didn't, well, I mean, I'm sure it must have raised eyebrows, right? I mean, ultimately, the theater commander actually had to approve all these death sentences. For the 92nd, all these general courts martial were being handled at the division level. So I'm sure for those theater commanders, it must have raised an eyebrow. Like, why is it that we're executing more individuals from your division than any other division in this theater, or for that matter, any in the ETO combined for all infantry divisions in the European theater? So yeah, anyway, deserves a much deeper, I think, exploration than we can probably get into right now. But anyway, okay, so next slide, if we were to go on, and this is just the last piece here on race. And don't really want to get too much into the particulars. I think this is actually more a reflection of what the government officially says about race versus what they don't say. And that's why I included this example. But to give you a thumbnail sketch of the story here, so this revolves around a Colonel William T. Coleman, who is the commander at Selfridge Field up in Michigan. In fact, the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, actually spend some time at Selfridge Field before deploying over to North Africa and over to Italy. Anyway, he's the field commander up there, and he's got this chauffeur, Private William McCrae. Apparently, Colonel Coleman doesn't like having or has put out directives that he doesn't want to have an African American chauffeur to begin with. Anyway, he ends up one for this period of time, and apparently, as you can see here, is the text reflects in a fit of drunken, irresponsible temper, shoots the Negro shoulder. A Negro soldier chauffeur, pardon me. All right, and so ultimately, what happens to Colonel Coleman? So he's going to be clearly relieved of command, goes through a general court martial. Pardon me. They're going to reduce him in grade to captain from colonel, and drop him all the way to the bottom of the promotion list for a period of 3 years. He can't receive temporary promotions. For instance, his promotion to colonel had been temporary. So that's a little bit of the backstory on Coleman. Ultimately, he's actually he does retire a little bit later in that year. Does make attempts later on through the Air Force to have his rank. I think actually they bump his rank back up to major ultimately, and there's some pay issues as well. But anyway, what's fascinating about the text here, this actually comes out of a report that the Committee on Military Affairs, as part of the U.S. House of Representatives, does in 46. And so they're talking about this particular example and kind of walking through it, and how they sort of don't appreciate the fact that it seems like the sentencing process appears to be pretty opaque in terms of how the court martial they arrive at the sentence that they do. But the text that really jumps out to me here is, it says, I'm just reading here verbatim. So it says, let's see. It is open to wonder what finding and sentence would have been applied had a drunken Negro soldier shot the colonel, right? And you very rarely find this sort of statement in official record, and particularly coming from Congress, right? So that really stood out to me. So yeah, I mean, there's an acknowledgement that clearly there is very, very much an issue, and it does beg the question, right? If the roles had been reversed, how would that African American soldier have been treated if he'd been the one that was doing the shooting?
Well, I think we know the answer to that, don't we? So
yes,
we can just unless we can just skip on, I think. But
a fait accompli. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So then moving. So that was the quantitative piece for today, and then moving into the specific examples here again, returning to murder and manslaughter. This time looking primarily at enemy victims, vice military personnel, vice enemy civilians, and so on and so forth. So to move on here, actually, and forgive me before we do get to that, there's a little bit of legal, I guess, international law 101 here that I thought might be helpful for individuals. So this both what I've pulled out here on this slide and then the very next slide, both are a reflection of the international law that's intended to govern the conduct of warfare at the time. So we are looking at primarily the Hague Convention of 1907, and we're looking at the Geneva Convention. There's actually two conventions that are enforced at the time through Geneva, and those are both passed in 1929. So just to quickly work through this here. Okay, so the first part of the text here, and forgive me, let me also add that the text I pulled here is actually coming from the War Department's field manual that actually lays out what the rules of land warfare are, right, for the Army Air Forces and for the Army. The version you're seeing here is the version that was published on the 1st of October, 1940. So this would have been carried through, of course, during much of the Second World War. Okay, so what does it say? A couple things here that I think are significant. First of all, it says that it is especially forbidden to kill or wound an enemy who, having laid down his arms or having no longer means of defense, has surrendered at discretion. Okay, and there's a direct connection from this. You can see some of the italicized text here. That's a direct connection back to the Hague Convention. Then the next piece refers to the handling of medical personnel. So it says a sanitary formation or establishment shall not be deprived of the protection accorded by Article 6 of the Geneva Convention by the fact that the personnel of a formation or establishment is armed and uses its arms in self-defense or in defense of its wounded and sick. And forgive me, I typically try not to just read slides verbatim, but basically what that's saying there, and hopefully I'm not speaking down to anyone, it's basically saying that medical personnel, they are allowed to be armed if it is strictly for self-defense or to defend the wounded or sick. They still receive a protected status, okay? So in other words, you shouldn't be shooting a medic or a doctor who is armed if they're only using those arms to protect themselves, or their patients. And there's a direct connection there. Again, you can see that italicized. That comes from the Geneva Convention in 1929. So why does this matter, right? Why do the rules of land warfare matter? Geneva Convention, Hague Convention, like who cares? Okay, so in practical terms, I would just share a couple things here for the group to consider, or the viewers to consider. One will be that the self-control that's needed to refrain from violations of the rules of land warfare under the stresses of combat are the same, right? The same good order and discipline that are going to be necessary to operate cohesively as a unit and effectively in war, okay? In addition to that, illegal actions can ultimately frustrate rather than accomplish the mission. So some examples there would be that if we are committing war crimes, enemy military or civilian resistance may actually increase as a result. Their resistance may stiffen. They may actually respond in kind with war crimes or actually escalate with even worse criminal reprisals, okay? On top of that, practically speaking, if we're killing prisoners of war, you are losing the potential for any intelligence you might be gaining from those prisoners of war, okay? In addition to that, looking back at our units, our allied units, so once individuals and units begin to commit war crimes with little or no accountability, the acts can snowball, right, into more serious or more numerous offenses, okay? And then also practically speaking, and we'll see an example here later on that occurs in March of 45, where if we are mishandling enemy POWs and that gets, or enemy civilian pilots, and that gets back to the enemy, then they are liable to, or there's a potential where they could treat our prisoners of war that are in captivity with them even worse, right? Okay, so then of course, above and beyond that, a few more things I would just share with you. One, there's perhaps it's a little bit more touchy-feely, but there's also just your operating ethically and morally to the extent that you can, in combat, under very, very trying in stressful conditions. Then also there's a whole issue of if we are trying to abide by these various conventions and the rules of land warfare, it's going to strengthen our legitimacy in the eyes of our own publics, of our partners and our allies, broaden support for our cause. And then finally, one last thing I just thought about kind of as an afterthought would be that there are also potential long-term mental health consequences, I think, for individuals that actually commit the war crimes. I mean, it's bad enough to sort of, to kill an enemy combatant, legally, right? But then to do it because you've been ordered to do it, or it's a convenient thing to do, or you're a psychopath, or whatever it is, that perhaps can create long-term, sort of enduring mental health consequences. Sort of once you've left service. So that was it there, Paul.
Good. No, this is all good stuff. I'm learning a lot. So yeah, we've moved on.
Okay, well, we'll move on then. Okay, this is the last piece from the rules of land warfare. Again, FM 27 TAC 1, and this talks about reprisals. And so it says, I won't read all this, but it says here at the very top of the text that I pulled out, reprisals against prisoners of war are expressly forbidden by the Geneva Convention of 1929. And of course, reprisals basically are acts of damage or injury that are against an enemy that we are going to carry out in reaction to something they've done to us. Okay, so even if, and I know this can be a very, very tall order, and for those of you perhaps that have been in these types of situations, maybe easier said than done, but the idea is, even if the enemy is committing war crimes that you aren't in turn going to carry out equally sort of horrific or even worse war crimes against their prisoners of war that you have in your own captivity. So I would just share that with the group. So what I'd like to do here, Paul, if time permitting, and if you're okay with it, again, moving then into the specific examples, a few more things I would want to say to sort of set up the remainder of the presentation. So one, well, I present here from this point forward, in succeeding slides will be a number of war crimes that were committed by U.S. forces during War II, primarily in the European theater, Mediterranean theater, in the North African theater. And what you're going to see, and this is, ladies and gentlemen, by design, with varying degrees of accountability for those crimes. So in some cases, what you're going to see is that court martials actually will be used to sort of mete out, punishment and perhaps deter, further criminal activity. There'll be other cases you're going to see here where informal unit actions are taken to punish and or deter. And then, unfortunately, in a number of cases, there doesn't appear to be any accountability whatsoever. So we'll see some of those as well, kind of across, the spectrum, and perhaps to be expected. So from that, what I've also done here, there are a few examples, Paul, where there are some incidents with a small number of deaths, and again, those are included for specific reasons. But the vast majority of what I've included, because I have run across a number of these cases. Well, the ones I'm trying to focus on are those that tend to have resulted in a larger number of deaths. So we'll definitely see that as we get into the latter part of 44, and then of course into 45 in the ETO. You'll see more and more of that. Also, and it's just, I think it's where we are and probably always will be, particularly with controversial topics like this, that everything I'm presenting is based upon very, very fragmentary evidence at best. Letters, diaries, personal memoirs, unofficial histories, media interviews, things of that nature. And the fact remains and stands that I think a lot of these actions, they just went to the grave, right? With veterans who either observed them or may have been perpetrators, may have tried to stop some of these acts from occurring. So of course, as you all know, I mean, anybody who studied this for a long time, that for any given infantry division or corps, whatever type you want to pick, you maybe you get like 5% or 1% of that formation, they'll actually ever end up writing a memoir or giving some sort of interview at some point. So yeah, just very, very fragmentary evidence at best, that at least in my judgment, I don't really think necessarily. I mean, that wasn't some sort of conspiracy or anything, but it wasn't really something I think that we wanted to have presented to begin with, really. I mean, it was dealt with during the war. We got all the court-martial records and whatnot, but yeah, not necessarily intended, I think, to sort of be, brought together sort of coherently. So yeah, we're dealing with fragmentary evidence here. It is what it is. What I'd like to ask, Paul, and to the audience here, as we step through the various slides, as you view the various bits and pieces of wherever I've been able to find it, primary sources, is to consider, from your perspective and your own judgment, whether or not the following crimes that I'm going to be presenting were handled appropriately, given the operational context. And of course, there are all kinds of variables in any given, operational environment or context. And would also to ask you, perhaps think about, or to challenge you to think about, perhaps what you might have done in similar circumstances, given all these variables. And then also would ask that we maybe think a little bit about, and would encourage everyone to look for examples, perhaps of where we see maybe physical courage versus moral courage. And I guess at least my opinion would be, for what that's worth, that moral courage is a much greater rarity, I think, than physical courage is. And if you find an individual where the two combine, that's of course, that's where I think perhaps many of us would like or aspire to be. But maybe look for examples of that, where you see perhaps someone who might be very, very brave and recipients of Bronze Stars and Silver Stars and all this, but perhaps doesn't necessarily demonstrate the moral courage in a particular instance. And then too, I think there's also the matter of moral distancing. That's one thing that I found with many of these examples we'll look at later on, is that aside from the court-martial records from the war, we don't tend to see these types of events captured. Sorry, poor choice of words, or reflected in after-action reports. They tend to not make them into after-action reports. They don't make them into unofficial and official, unit histories. And so what we tend to really rely upon primarily, I mean, there are some, singular examples from the wartime period, but we're really heavily reliant upon what veterans have shared during the last maybe 20 or 30 years, where some, let me just caveat that or underscore that, have been much more willing to share, I think, some of these sort of less or more controversial aspects of the war than perhaps they might have previously. But even with that said, with those individuals that have been willing to discuss some of these particularly sensitive topics, still I think that we find, and this I'm not trying to pass judgment or anything, but I would ask that maybe as we go through again the charts today, you think about examples of moral distancing. And so what you typically find when veterans will talk about these instances where they are willing to divulge any of this, is it typically maybe they will talk about the event and sort of talk about it more as a bystander or an observer. They tend to not use specific names, and so they will rarely sort of dime out someone that they spent months or years with in combat. They're not going to sort of out individuals by name, in their sort of their twilight years. So you tend not to see the names used. So just I think something else to consider as we go forward. So different aspects of maybe moral distancing, where the veterans think it's important to get the information out there, but they aren't necessarily going to give a lot of specifics. And hey, I was more of a bystander and I saw this occur. Want to share the information, but I wasn't necessarily involved.
I just want to go back to what you said at the beginning of that little talk there about the idea that in the study of this, there doesn't seem to be any kind of consistency in how these capital crimes were treated, because Paul Johnson said the same thing in his show about Brookwood, is that those 20 names that were executed, it's not like you could follow a flow chart where they all fulfilled certain criteria. They were, depending on what theater, which time of year it was, which time of era of the war it was, there was no kind of consistency to why these cases were pushed the way they were. And I think that randomness is intriguing. If there was some set of criteria, say, well, when it's this type of case, it always goes to this type of resolution, that would be interesting. But the fact you can't, I think, says something. Yeah, definitely. And really, I mean, ultimately, unless it's being, pushed from on high, and of course, then you get into these issues of undue command influence, which we try to avoid in the military. But this really comes down to commander's discretion in many cases, right? So the commander, I mean, perhaps even if the commander may not think that there is sufficient evidence or witnesses, and I should have added that as well, right? That in many of these cases, the evidence and the witnesses just, they weren't even there at the time necessarily, right? If you're the one guy going off and escorting the POW to a collection point, and then you return 5 minutes later and the collection point was an hour away, then sort of who is going to sort of divulge what, actually happened or didn't happen. But commander's discretion ultimately in many cases as to whether or not a court-martial is going to be convened. And there is an example later on with William Wharton where he talks about in his memoir, Shrapnel, and how
sort of how the commander goes through this process to determine, well, we're going to try to pursue a general court-martial. Are we going to go with perhaps, a special or a summary as well? And as we talked about back, I think it was in the first show, when you look at each of those different sort of stratifications of court-martial, you're talking, so it's a different composition, right? So you can only hold a certain type of court-martial, certain echelons. So for instance, general court-martial division and above. The number of individuals required to actually compose a court-martial are different. The types of sentences you can carry out. So general court-martial is an example. Capital offenses is an example. Life imprisonment, death penalty. But when you begin working your way down, for example, say to a special court-martial or summary court-martial, that court-martial, they are limited in the length of sentence that they can actually have carried out. They can only take so much pay. They're also limited in terms of how much pay they can take away from individuals. So those are also considerations as well. And I think that really remains the case even today. I mean, again, ultimately, it's going to be commander's discretion as to how this is pursued. And as you said, Paul, there are just so many variables and different contexts and actors that come into play. There's no sort of one size fits all sort of way to you kind of go through this industrial process. Okay, A, B, C, it's always going to be this way. Every single case of this type we're going to handle it this way. No, there are just way too many factors and complicating factors involved to say you're always going to handle a case in a particular fashion.
Well, while this slide has been on screen, I think we've all drawn a conclusion from it already. So I'll be interested to hear the actual story behind it, because we've all kind of seen something there. So over to you.
Yeah, well, and this slide is making a repeat appearance. So actually, I've shared this now a couple of times, and so we really don't have to get into any of the specifics. But in terms of just a very, very brief orientation, as a reminder, left-hand side of the chart. So again, this is coming from the at the time it was called the USFET, right? No longer the ETO, Judge Advocate General Branch Office History. So the upper left-hand chart basically gives you all of the various accused, all those that are accused of murder. Right, and then it's broken down by the different categories of victims. So when you see a particular number, and of course what we're talking about today is primarily POW murder or manslaughter. So the number there is 39. That doesn't mean that 39 POWs were killed. It's that there were 39 who were accused of murdering POWs. So the numbers might actually be somewhat larger. And then it's just as a quick reminder here. So there are 36 whites that are accused, and then three non-whites, one of whom actually is on the slide here. That's Private Rice from the 3,222nd Quartermaster. He actually is an African-American soldier who is one of those accused, and ultimately found guilty for killing a German, actually a Frenchman who's been conscripted into the German army, who he thinks is SS. But anyway, I digress. And then the lower left-hand chart there basically is just showing this trend line. So basically taking all of the accused and then laying it out all the way from July 42, where the records begin, all the way to October 45. And I think we actually talked about this in a previous show, where, I mean, it's a pretty logical, I think, in terms of the peaks and valleys, where you see it to begin to increase with the invasion in Normandy, then it peaks again with the Battle of the Bulge. And then we kind of get that mountaintop, when we actually get into when I say the invasion of Germany, I'm really talking about the crossing of the Rhine and everything sort of east of the Rhine. So we're talking about, I guess late March all the way 45 to the end of the war. So, but all I really wanted to just, I think, get across with this chart was just to convey that there certainly are instances where there are commanders who, based upon all these various factors and variables that we've been talking about earlier, actually are willing to hold their soldiers accountable, through a general court-martial, which again carries the heaviest sentences again for those capital crimes. So we do see some examples here. The 39 we have, again, I guess, 6 here altogether. We've talked about 4 previously. And so there actually are some slides that are dedicated to Second Lieutenant Acunto out of the, I guess it's how you pronounce his name, Acunto, out of the 87th Infantry Division. So we'll look at him, and Lieutenant Colonel Callahan out of the 20th Armored Division. There's a slide dedicated to him later on as well. So that was really just the point to make there. That as we look across the sort of spectrum of accountability, this really is the high end, and there are indeed some individuals, some commanders who are willing to kind of go to that high end and pursue a general court-martial. And I think that should pretty much do it here, Paul, on this chart. All right, so Yeah, we are returning to the 101st Airborne Division in Normandy. We keep coming back to that repeatedly. So that's where I think we'd finished up last time, looking at Johnny Leitch out of the Able Company, 501st PIR, and Father Sampson, and some other cases. So we'll just return there briefly, not because I'm trying to fixate on the 101st, but because I think it does give us some illustrations of what I was talking about earlier about different types of accountability. Okay, so to walk through this, and I should say up front, of course, we're going to be in the ETO for the vast majority of these slides. We are talking about murder here, and the source is none other than Mark Bando, who, of course, I think arguably is the dean of 101st Airborne Division historian. So he is the source for this particular story. Okay, so to walk you through some of the basics here, and I think a lot of it's already conveyed here on the slide. So there's an individual by the name of Lieutenant William Russo. He is the platoon leader for the Mortar Platoon in 2nd Battalion, 501st PIR. And on the 12th of June, he orders one of his subordinates to execute a German POW somewhere in the vicinity of Hill 30. Well, that doesn't sit well with one of Lieutenant Russo's subordinates. In fact, his name was Virgil Di Piero. And so he takes the matter to first his battalion commander, or up to his battalion commander. I'm sure he went through his company commander first, but ultimately takes it to Lieutenant Colonel Ballard, his battalion commander, works his way all the way up to Colonel Johnson, aka Jumpy Johnson of the 501st PIR. And really, his appeals or his concerns are falling on deaf ears. So Father Sampson, who is the regimental chaplain for the 501st PIR, he gets wind of what's going on, and then he intervenes on behalf of Virgil Di Piero and of the platoon. And again, you'll recall we talked about Father Sampson before, where he orders actually Johnny Leitch not to shoot 2 Fallschirmjäger who have been captured. That's ultimately not successful. That he goes ahead and he shoots the 2 Fallschirmjäger. But we see Father Sampson again here trying to intervene. So I know that he published a book during his lifetime, which I'm sure is a great read, but it would be fascinating to learn more about. I'm sure there's a lot more to know about Father Sampson, but it's just fascinating. Sort of trying to act as the moral and ethical compass, I think, for this unit, I think really stands out. So he intervenes, and maybe surprisingly, I don't know, actually, he is somewhat successful. So Father Sampson actually, and we don't know whether it was Colonel Ballard or Colonel Johnson who make the decision, but ultimately, Lieutenant Russo is actually pulled from his platoon, and he is then serves as an adjutant, to one of the senior officers in the regiment for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. They go back to UK to reset, of course, going to Holland. He's then with I think it's 1st of the 501st. Ultimately, so having done this, having ordered the execution of this prisoner, it still works out pretty well for Lieutenant Russo. Ultimately, he ends up actually in command of Charlie Company. 1st Battalion, 501st PIR, later in the war, through Holland and then Battle of the Bulge and on to the into the war from there. So that's what. So what we see here is an example of punishment for a war crime that's being handled sort of unofficially, within the unit. There's no court martial or anything of that nature being handled unofficially. But actually, Virgil Di Piero, he does say, maybe this was, I guess, in his interviews with Mark Bando, says that he did want to serve under Lieutenant Russo after, all this comes to light. Of course, we've already talked about what happens to Russo eventually. One other interesting thing that Mark Bando points out about this particular instance is that the sergeant, the NCO who actually carries out Russo's order to execute the prisoner, this is from Mark Bando, says that the actual shooter or perpetrator was haunted by what he'd done, and he always wanted a medic right beside him in Holland because he knew he was going to get it, and ultimately he does. He ultimately is killed. I think it was by if I recall, shrapnel head wound. So he actually dies outside of Vagel, 25 September 44. That's the actual perpetrator. Again, Russo is going to survive the war. Jumpy Johnson up there in the upper left-hand corner, one of those. And of course, you can see what Colonel Johnson says here on the slide, right? So when Father Sampson approaches the regimental commander, Johnson says, launches into a tirade. My boys have been killed by Hun bastards. Is Di Piero crazy to give a rip about one lousy crap prisoner? Of course, Johnson also does not survive the war. He also well, he's killed in Holland at a place called the Island. I think it's 8th October 44 is when Jumpy Johnson ultimately meets his demise. So that would be an example, like I said, of an unofficial handling of a war crime.
And we can assume that, you talked about the fact that very few units have more than a very small percentage of people who write their memoirs. The exception is true for the 101st. We have a huge amount of memoirs from the 101st compared to other divisions. So without making any definite assumptions, we can assume that if these sort of incidents were happening and were being dealt with at a kind of company or regimental level, in this division, they are probably happening in other units as well. But why would you assume they're not? These situations, they're encountering similar combat against similar aged people with similar training and similar theater. You would assume it's going to be happening across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah, no doubt whatsoever. And like you said, Paul, it's just because, as we know, the 101st is probably at this stage the most heavily, or one of the most heavily documented and research divisions, of the world, at least for the U.S. Yeah. Bar none. So yeah, absolutely. If we were to go and look at other divisions out there, we would find similar types of behavior.
And by the way, folks, if just to those watching, if you happen to be reading a bio or a regimental history or a book, and you come across a story of some kind of crime that is prevented or averted or hushed up or moved on, let me or Mark know, because neither of us have read every single book available. So there may be other stories out there that would add to our knowledge. So if you do find one, folks, let us know.
I can't thank you enough for saying that, because I would. I know it's kind of an unpleasant and it's a controversial topic, but I would sort of flip that around and say that there's an opportunity to learn. I would hope, but particularly with what I do, educating military officers, that we can learn from these things and try to do whatever we can. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, it doesn't matter what time period it is. You're always going to have some degree of your unit psychopaths, sociopaths, sort of easily sort of manipulated, whatever the case might be, that are going to carry out these types of, not just these types of criminal behavior, but others as well. Right. But still, I think that we've got a responsibility as historians, researchers, and whatnot, to try to do whatever we can to try to mitigate this, to try to prevent it from occurring, and maybe look at examples as to how perhaps in the past it has been handled well, how accountability was addressed and taken care of, and perhaps other instances where it wasn't so much. The last thing I want to say here also, Paul, which I think ties in nicely with your point, and this is the last thing I was going to share, and this is verbatim from Mark Bando, tying back to the Russo incident. So he says, and he's of course referring here specifically to the 101st. So I'm just quoting him verbatim. He says that in that platoon at least, and he's talking here about the mortars within 2nd Battalion, 501st PIR. He says in that platoon at least, there was zero tolerance for such behavior. And right, and that's one of the reasons why DPRO is like, hey, we need to try to get our platoon leader out of here. But then Bando goes on to say, while certain individuals in other companies and regiments of the 101st continued such behavior throughout the war, with seemingly no personal or other consequences. And what I think that speaks to is unit culture. So there's the culture of the Airborne, there's the culture of each of the Airborne divisions. There are subcultures. So for instance, going back to, as I mentioned previously, sort of the many downsides to violating the rules of land warfare is that if we've got a subculture within a particular platoon or company where this is accepted, it's been normalized, well, obviously it's creating a very, very toxic and potentially criminal subculture. But to try to take, a particular unit and then sort of take that and cast very, very wide sort of, aspersions, overgeneralizing across an entire division, I think would not be not be fair.
We all know the examples, even from just war films, of how influential a platoon sergeant or platoon commander or company commander can be. His tone, his characteristics, the way he sets about is he someone out for revenge? I mean, even from comic books and things, that influence could be huge. I mean, without going into a rabbit hole, but we did a show about Ron Spears last week. So Dick Winters, Ron Spears, what different type of men were going to have an effect on the men under them in how they are playing this game called war, what the morality is and how we're going to do it and how we're going to just set up our team in a sense. So I can understand incredibly how different it would go from platoon to platoon within different companies and regiments and within different divisions. You know, we're you know, the fact that Mark said that platoon had a very low tolerance, and yet maybe just in the same regiment there's another platoon where a very different style is set up because of some charismatic leader who is fighting the war in a slightly different manner. It's not, we're not here to judge necessarily. We're just trying to understand the circumstances of why things may happen more or less in different types of unit. But we'll move on, I think, because this is fascinating stuff. But let's move to the next slide. I'm going to take control.
Please do. Save me from myself. Okay. So yeah, moving on, still ETO, and this, I think, this should be the last 101st example here. So many of you, I suspect, have read David Webster's classic, Parachute Infantry, which was published actually posthumously. He died. Anybody who's looked into his history dies in 1961, definitely before his time. That's actually him up there in the upper left-hand corner in Holland. Okay, so this particular case study here, or this particular example, relates back to, again, how are you going to handle medical personnel? And I actually decided to include this based upon the show that you had, Paul, about the Battle of Lanzarote Ridge, and looking at the Fallschirmjäger that were involved there. And as I recall, I think it was Greg Way. Forgive me if I'm not getting the name completely correct.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, I think he did point out that there were two German medics who actually were shot. I think they were shot by the INR platoon out of the 394th Infantry, but it was because they were carrying pistols, right? Both carrying pistols. So, and again, I'm not a Fallschirmjäger expert. I don't know if that was standard kit, for Fallschirmjäger or other, Sanitats personnel within the Wehrmacht, or what the case might be. But at least in that instance, fairly safe to say, again, sort of in accordance with the Geneva Convention, for self-defense, for protecting the patient, as is allowed by the Geneva Convention. So yeah, I went ahead and that, when I heard Greg talk about that with Lanzarote Ridge, I thought I would bring in one more example as well, a little bit earlier on. So again, back to Normandy, I think for the final slide on Normandy here. So yeah, this comes right out of David Webster's book, back in Normandy, and quite a bizarre situation. So he talks about how this German Jeep, I suspect he's talking about a Kubelwagen, how it sort of emerges from the smoke there. Perhaps the driver, who, by the way, is Fallschirmjäger, might be sort of disoriented, lost, who knows? But he's flying this Red Cross flag, 2 wounded Germans on stretchers in the back, sort of driving along. And apparently a lot of the troopers, U.S. troopers in the air, are just sort of taken aback and so stunned by what they're seeing that nobody really reacts to. Well, somebody does, ultimately. That's an officer, with this group of paratroopers, commandeers the Kubelwagen. It's probably safe to say that's what it was. Ultimately does shoot the driver because, again, rationale given here is because he's carrying a pistol, and then the 2 wounded that were in the back of the vehicle were left on the side of the road, to die. So, what we don't know here, what I try to do is to identify, motivations and accountability. I don't know, because we had talked earlier about the, at least from my perspective, the illegal order that was issued, I think, at division level, to take no prisoners, in the early days of the operations there in Normandy, not just 101st. We also find it in the 82nd, some other units as well. So is this is this a carryover from that order, or is there something else that's motivating this? In terms of accountability, I can't find any example of real accountability for this occurring necessarily, but it happened. And we've already talked about it, at least in terms of international law and in terms of the rules of land warfare, how it should have been handled. But, and of course, we can't just take 3 data points. We can't just take the examples from Lanzarote Ridge and here and say that, oh, this was happening in all instances across the ETO. I mean, there are, as many of your viewers know, and Paul, there are examples of many examples of both sides, I think, respecting this protected status of medical personnel. Of course, there's those classic stories of the ceasefires that take place in the Hurtgen Forest on multiple occasions, where wounded are being, kind of extracted from the battlefield and this kind of thing. And both sides, combatants are assisting one another's wounded. So yeah, it's not kind of black and white, right? But again, we do see another example, and it was, again, Greg Way's presentation that made me think about including this one example from Webster's book. So that was it, I think, on this one.
Brilliant.
Okay. And then going on, of course, I want to be inclusive here. So we've looked at African-American, or at least one African-American perpetrator, Rice, and a number of white perpetrators. So I also wanted to bring in the Nisei, like trying to be sort of, like I said, as inclusive as possible. So this one actually, again, so it's still ETO here. And this, we're really talking here about reprisals. Already gave you what the law says about that. And this ties back to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the temporal context is during operations in the Vosges Mountains. So we're now fast forwarding from, say, June, July 44. This is now occurring in October 44. And of course, this is a fascinating story. I'm trying not to digress and start talking about the Lost Battalion and all that. Fascinating story in and of itself. But again, I mean, I think these types of acts, they aren't they aren't unique to any particular race or any particular religion, right? So given sort of the right or maybe the wrong conditions, just about anybody, I think, could be pushed to perhaps at least consider, if not act upon, what's being done to them, what they're seeing. So in this instance, in the Vosges Mountains here, so you can see or read the text there. I didn't know this before I started researching this example, but apparently there was a real love-hate relationship, I think more of a hate than love, between the 442nd and the commander of I think he was the 36th ID, Major General Dahlquist. It's actually his picture up there. Apparently he would really just sort of drive the 442nd, irrespective of casualties and condition, that kind of thing. So that's what he's doing here in the Vosges in October 44. So yeah, you can see what occurs. And this is actually the flip side of what we looked at before, where in this case, it's actually the Germans who are targeting, let's see here, wounded, who are actually on stretchers. And so we can see here, even with the Nisei, like, many others, as we see here, the Nisei resolved that day they would take no more prisoners, as a result of the Germans firing upon their wounded. And again, there are other examples out there, of this. I have, there's one, in fact, the earliest wartime example that I have found where actually in a letter, surprisingly, and there are some letters out there that convey this, oftentimes not, because of course they're going through censors. But it's a letter from a colonel who's in the 5th Infantry Division, September 44, and does say that, hey, we're not taking SS prisoner, and it's because they are shooting at our medics. I mean, so this isn't just kind of the one-off, but yeah, that was the earliest example that I saw where, in this letter, this colonel is talking about, we're not taking SS prisoner, and here's why, right? So this all kind of precedes Malmedy and all that, and there are other examples. I won't bore you with other examples, but yeah, there's some others out there as well of Germans targeting either medics, or wounded personnel, and of course they're also on the other side where perhaps we're doing some of the same. Often in the context of reprisals. And I think that does it for now with the 442nd. So an amazing group of individuals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a little bit of a shift in gears here now to look at things from more of a German perspective. So again, ETO, we're now moving from October into November 1944. I actually sourced, of all places, the ICRC, International Committee for Red Cross, to get this particular example. So what this lays out here is an example of either, you can call it PO, prisoner of war, abuse, misuse, whatever term you think fits here. And actually, I should also mention that if we were to go back to the field manual that governs or conveys the rules of land warfare, it does say in there, per the Geneva Convention, that work done by prisoners of war shall have no direct relation with war operations. And it also says it is forbidden to use prisoners of war on unhealthful or dangerous work. And this is all out of the 1929 Geneva Convention. Anyway, we have an example here where I think this is, and I'm trying to read my own slide. So this is near Kirchberg and Jülich in November of 44, where some German POWs are being forced to dig trenches for some American units that are near the front lines, and they're actually doing it under German artillery fire. So as a result of being forced to carry out this work, 2 of these German POWs are killed, and then another 20 are wounded. So I don't know exactly how this gets back to the the Oberkommando Wehrmacht, the OKW ultimately, but there is one of these POWs, maybe he escapes, I don't know, but he is able to communicate back to the OKW what has occurred, and again, it's a violation of the Geneva Convention. So, and I know it seems a little bit maybe counterintuitive to think of this happening, or that the Nazi Germany would have these kinds of structures established, but they actually had an organization called the Wehrmacht War Crimes Bureau, and so they were a part of, as I recall, I'm trying to remember now. Yeah, so they're actually a part of the legal department within the OKW, and they would actually collect reports on both alleged Allied and, oh, by the way, German war crimes as well, for purposes of diplomatic protests, war crimes trials, things of that nature. A lot of what they were collecting, there's been a book written about this, a lot of what they were collecting was based upon war crimes that were taking place in the East, Ukraine and Russia, for instance, the Katyn massacre, some others. Of course, there are also some examples in there of the French, the British, us, the U.S. committing some war crimes as well. So this is an example of a report from a German POW getting back somehow to the Wehrmacht War Crimes Bureau, and they actually do lodge a formal protest. They do it through neutral Switzerland back to the U.S. government, and it's actually lodged in January of 45. So kind of fascinating to think that this is happening, and there may be a book out there on this particular topic, but I think it would be just so interesting to see what types of communications are actually flowing. Maybe not just the Wehrmacht War Crimes Bureau, but what kinds of diplomatic communications are still taking place between Nazi Germany and the U.S. or the U.K., any allied government. Because we sort of want to think that, can we kind of put up these barriers, or we're not talking to one another at all? But no, so diplomacy still goes on. It would be interesting to see other examples of this, of this occurring. So again, a little bit there on the Wehrmacht War Crimes Bureau, and at least one protest that was lodged by the Germans, right, for a violation of the Geneva Convention against us, against the U.S.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. We'll move.
Okay. So, okay, what we see here. So now we're moving into the time period of the Battle of the Bulge, really into the last, 6 months or so of the war in Europe. Still in the ETO. The example here is from the 82nd Airborne Division, 505th PAR, to be exact. And so in this particular instance, and actually this comes from an interview with a veteran that Patrick O'Donnell had done. Many of you have probably read his book Beyond Valor. So as part of the interviews he was doing with vets, talks with one that talks about how they were in this very sort of precarious situation. And of course, this is occurring on Christmas Eve of all things, in 1944, where the 505th is in a bit of a trying to think of the right word here. It's just a vulnerable sort of position, right? Kind of out beyond Allied lines, and so they are ordered to withdraw, and there are only 8 to 10 of them that are in this particular position. Okay, again from the 505th. So they're debating. So they have 20 some odd German prisoners, and actually in the text there, and it's hard to read there, but it does state that they actually were SS, which does make sense because at this time the 505th was fighting elements of the 1st SS, 2nd SS, 9th SS. There's also a Volksgrenadier division kind of thrown in for good measure. So it is plausible that they were SS. But there's a decision made. And so here, I think I would, in terms of motivation, I would probably chalk this up to tactical necessity. That's how this was viewed at the time. So this group of 8 to 10, GIs, paratroopers, concludes that, hey, there's no way that we're going to be able to make a withdrawal at nighttime in the woods. We don't know where we are. We're in the snow. And oh, by the way, we're going to drag along 20 some odd German POWs. So I think you pretty much know where the story ends, right? So yes, they do make the withdrawal, but there are no German POWs with those 8 to 10 GIs when they make the withdrawal. So and of course this is I think a classic example where again we're talking about a very, very small group, and it's kind of surprising that any of them would be willing to divulge this, but because again it's a small group, and there probably are many other instances like this where there weren't many of them to begin with. It happens. Again, they don't necessarily want to portray any of their battle buddies in a bad light, so it just kind of passes into the mists, of history. So again, example here of what I would consider to be tactical necessity. But that can be difficult when you have to start pulling triggers, right? And the Germans realize what it is it's actually happening to them.
And again, for every case you have found, we can assume they're going to be more widespread in different sets of circumstances, because the number of people in combat, the number of people that might be in this situation where they've found themselves vulnerable and they've got prisoners of war, you can imagine that for every case you've discovered, there are a considerable number that haven't come to light for these various reasons of it just being kind of moving on, and people who are witnessing it just forgetting about it. The more, it's fascinating.
But, and then to be fair, there's also the exact opposite, and I would like to think, and I think that the POW numbers, in the hundreds of thousands, right, bear this out. That fortunately there are a lot more instances of, I mean, the viewers can sort of can make their own judgments and reach their own conclusions, but there are many more instances where I think we're going to find that POWs are actually being handled per international law.
Yeah, I mean, and Brad is watching from on this day in Canadian military history, and every time he on his channel, or I on my channel, or JD on History Underground talk about the atrocities committed by the 12th SS against Canadians, someone always says, yeah, but the Canadians and the Brits also killed some SS they found, and none of us are ever denying that these incidents happened, because they almost certainly did in small numbers. But then, as you say there, you've got to offset that with the huge numbers of POWs we absolutely categorically know were put on boats and sent back to England and went to POW camps in the Britain or the USA or Canada, wherever they went. So like you said at the beginning about the capital crimes, these cases are really rare from Allied units killing German POWs or Axis POWs are very rare, which is great. And yet, if we were to start looking at the crimes committed, and it's not a competition, this in the Eastern Front by the Axis forces, if we started listing them, we would take weeks to just listing them. So it is interesting.
Yeah, and I will go out on a bit of a limb here. I think it's fair to say, and this is not sort of trying to take the balance sheet sort of judgment to history and, well, they did this and we did that, but I guess what my conclusion would be generally, and I fully acknowledge that that elements of the Wehrmacht and then certainly the Waffen-SS to a greater degree, I mean, what they were doing against civilians, I think, I mean, what we were doing sort of pales in comparison to what they were doing against civilians. I do think, though, in terms of POW handling, and again, there are those exceptions out there that we all know pretty well, but I would say that the treatment is fairly even, on at least in Northwestern Europe, right? So yeah, I mean, there may be some more that the SS committed, but generally speaking, we're pretty much treating each other's sides about the same in terms of capture and trying to provide adequate shelter, protection, all this. But then, as you said, Paul, I think you get to the east and it's a completely different ball game. Obviously, the international law, all this kind of goes out the window. Maybe to a lesser extent. I mean, in the Asiatic Pacific theater of operations, you look at Japan and China, other examples. But anyway, I'm digressing again. Maybe I went on a bit of a limb there, but
let's move on.
Okay, but anyway, yeah. So, and I guess the last thing, we have to go back to the previous slide, but the one thing I think also bears consideration here too is just what else is happening in the environment at the time. What are these GIs hearing? What are they seeing? So let's also bear in mind that, again, this is 24 December 1944. these paratroopers have been in an isolated position for some period of time. So we don't know at this stage, whether or not they might have heard of the Normandy Massacre, which of course occurs on 17 December 44. But of course that spreads like wildfire. Through the the Allied forces. So that's something that of course we don't know. Does that particular event impact the decision making here? We will see some cases later on where it's kind of used as a retroactive justification to kill POWs. But here, I'm not so sure, right? Because this is again about a week, after Normandy, and so these guys at that stage might not have heard that it had occurred. I think that given that they're SS, perhaps they would have, maybe never taken them prisoner to begin with, if they had heard about Normandy at that stage. But anyway, I think something just to consider, right? That's another thing that is going to be entering into, in many cases, split second decision making about whether you're going to fire at the person with his hands up or not, take them prisoner. So I think it bears on all this as well. Okay, so moving on to the our next example here, and so of any of the atrocities that U.S. forces may have committed in the ETO, primarily where we're focusing most of our conversation here, the three that are probably known the best would be the Chino Massacre, which is what this Chino Massacre, which is what this deals with, and then the Dachau Massacre, and then the last actually is in the Mediterranean theater. That's the Cavalry Massacre. So here we are on the kind of the first of the three, and that's Chino. So I won't go into a bunch of detail here. Again, I suspect many of you are probably pretty familiar with this particular story. If you're interested, if you want to get more background on this, there's a group called Reveal that did a great audio production. It's like an hour-long production just about the Chino Massacre, where they go back and actually interview Belgians on the ground who were there at the time, GIs who witnessed what occurred. Really, really fascinating. So that's worth checking out. And then, of course, Paul, I don't know. Hopefully, it's okay for me to say this. I think actually it's kind of a good thing, to be honest, because I don't really believe that this topic really gets the attention that it deserves. So Mark Felton, and I know that there are very strong opinions out there, sort of for and against, but Mark Felton actually last year, I think to his credit, did a video where he compares and contrasts Normandy and the Chino Massacre. And oh, by the way, as of yesterday, when I checked it, he has 900,000 views on that particular video. So, not to say that it was well done or it's not well done or it's historically accurate, but I think one good thing that comes out of that, though, is it sparks a discussion. So you can go to that particular YouTube, and it's fascinating to see the hundreds of people that are now talking about, oh, well, my grandfather said this, and I heard that, and hey, what was the right decision, and why did it happen? And so at least sort of sparking again the conversation and getting this topic out there, getting it a little bit of attention, I thought was interesting. So here on the left-hand side, you actually have the exact text out of Patton's diary, January 4th, 45. Not trying to do, maybe I am doing a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking, but it's kind of surprising that Patton would actually write this in his diary. Maybe he thought that he'd be able. Of course, he didn't think I'm sure he didn't think he was going to die, later in 1945, and could go back and sort of manage what it was that he'd written down. But he documents this, and in fact, this is one of the principal ways we know that this massacre occurred. So you can actually see the text verbatim. It's on the right-hand side there. I know Patton's maybe handwriting is a little bit difficult to decipher, but that's what he says about the Chino Massacre on the right-hand side of the slide. So there you have it. And what I think also, and let me just, before I get into some other areas. So in terms of the accountability, there is no accountability for this. Nobody's ever found any sort of, connection to courts martial or anything at all for any of the individuals. It's allegedly Baker Company, 21st Armored Infantry Battalion that commit this particular war crime. Oh, by the way, and I guess it's not a surprise at all, right? But if you go to the 11th Armored Division Association website, if you go to they've got unit histories up for the battalion, for the company. Like, obviously, there's no mention whatsoever of the Chino Massacre. I guess it's not to be that's to be expected. But anyway, so back to motivations. I think it's fairly safe to say that this is a reprisal for Normandy. I think that's the way that many have viewed this, kind of a eye for an eye type of scenario. But what's interesting, I think, also to consider here too, is that as Patton states here in his diary, hey, I hope that we can cover up this particular war crime. Kind of his thought process for doing that, like what made him conclude that he wanted to conceal this, I think would be interesting. I've been kind of debating this the last couple of days. So, so as part of it for self-preservation, because as you know, he's had a couple of scrapes, with Biscari massacres, the slapping incidents, all this. He misses out on the initial landings in Normandy. So is it not kind of wanting to bring attention to one of his subordinate formations? So as part of this self-preservation, as part of this concern for the troops, anyway, we'll never know, right? We can't get inside Patton's head to know what he was thinking when he concluded that he wanted to cover up this particular war crime. But anyway, some things I was thinking about as I was looking at this particular particular case here, and I don't think that there was, let's see, just checking here, too much more to say about Chinon. Although I guess I might say more broadly in terms of motivations. We've covered some of this already with reprisals, with tactical considerations. Also logistical support could also come into play, where perhaps you don't have sufficient rations or can't provide sufficient shelter. That I think also could play into decisions about whether or not you retain someone as a prisoner of war. I think also there's a matter of convenience, right? And also a matter of impunity. So as Paul, as you were talking about, if you get into one of those units with maybe a bit of a toxic culture where just about anything goes, that perhaps, some individuals might feel emboldened that, hey, I'm not going to be held accountable. The platoon leader and the platoon sergeant think it's okay. So, hey, I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to get away with it. So, so why not?
Okay.
All right.
Cool.
And then moving on from the Chino Massacre, we go to Paul Fusil next. Still ETO at this point. We're in the early part of 1945. Many of you have probably heard the name Paul Fusil before. Very, very well known and renowned World War I and World War II historian, who himself is a veteran of the 103rd Infantry Division, Bronze Star, Purple Heart recipient, and all that. So, but he later in life related one story, and you can actually see the text, whether you want to look at the New York Times article there or the text that I've pulled out of it. But he does relate one story, kind of interesting. So he refers to it here as the Great Turkey Shoot, when American boys, much like himself, ignored the visible wish of a group of several dozen Germans to surrender, instead laughing and howling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our men exultantly shot into the crater until every single man down there was dead. And wow, motivations for that, and of course I'll take the veteran kind of sort of at face value that he says that this occurred. So the motivations for that, that's a tough one to sort of try to figure out what was going through GI's heads when they did that. But one thing I think perhaps as a leader that comes to mind, and oh, by the way, that's Paul Fusil there in his Ike jacket and CIB upper left-hand corner in Paris toward the end of the war. But some things that came to mind to me would be that, number one, so does Fusil, at the time when he's with the 103rd, because he talks about later on in the New York Times article how, the result was deep satisfaction and the event was transformed into an amusing narrative, told and retold over campfires all that winter. So the questions that come to mind for me would be, okay, so did Fusil actually see this occur, right? Or did he just hear about it? Did he actually know any of the perpetrators? And then perhaps most importantly, because he was a leader at the time and a commissioned officer, did he do anything about it, right? So was any action taken to try to rectify any of this or to try to hold anyone accountable? And at this stage, of course, where I'm in the research, I don't know, but certainly a very, very troubling example of a war crime.
Mm.
Particularly sort of when joviality and almost like it's a game. that's pretty disturbing, I guess, at least from my perspective. So
yeah. Cool.
All right, moving on. Yeah. Okay. So the next one goes back again to POW misuse. I guess in this case you might consider this. Well, actually, I think I would consider this more in terms of motivation. Incompetence, I think, comes into play, also in insufficient training, and then also a degree of negligence as well. So this is fascinating because this is actually going to appear in the New York Times. I've only found 2 articles in the Times from the war where there's really any reference at all to a U.S. War crime. This is one, and then there's one more that we'll talk about. At some point we're going to reach a cutoff. So at some point we'll see if we actually get to the other example. It's a Mediterranean theater example. So yeah, this actually does appear in the New York Times on the 6th of April, 1945, and it's done deliberately. Okay, so when Eisenhower gets word of this, he deliberately gets the word out. It goes into the New York Times, and this incident is communicated to the OKW, right? So he wants it to be clear to the Germans, hey, this was not, deliberate. This was not intentional. We don't want you to turn around and sort of, identify an equal number of our POWs that are in your camps and shoot them, whatever the case might be. So it's really fascinating how Eisenhower handles this example. But again, this is ETO, and in a nutshell, what happens is there are a number of 40 and 8, kind of like the standard, French. Was it? I'll embarrass myself with the French. Is it 40 hommes, 8 chevaux, something like that?
Yeah, 40 hommes, 8 chevaux. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 40 men or 8 horses. Yeah, that's
exactly. Yeah. So the standard sort of French boxcar. Well, what happens? So they're using these to transport German POWs. Like the further you get away from the actual POW cages, which are closer to the actual front line. So more of like an administrative move of these POWs. So what happens is they are refurbishing some of these boxcars. And this is, I think, where the incompetence comes in, right? Somebody lines these boxcars with plywood and leaves no slits or spaces or anything for ventilation, right? So it's basically just a plywood, like a complete sort of plywood box, no way to get any air or anything, sunshine or anything at all. I can't see outside. So you kind of know where this is all heading ultimately. There are so many POWs that we are processing at this point in the war that the units that would typically have responsibility for this, they are called POW escort guard companies. They're military police company formations. There aren't enough basically in theater at the time to conduct all this. So they begin to bring in other formations to do this work. Okay, so in this particular example here, 16 March 45, there are actually 2 episodes altogether that occur. They're actually using personnel from the 16th Armored Division that hasn't actually, and as many of the viewers know, it's one of the last divisions to see combat, to be committed to combat. So while they're still in France, they're being used to take part in this transport activity. They receive insufficient training. They don't speak German, so when there's pounding on the boxcars and these guys are shouting, I mean, that they can't get any air or anything, they just, I guess they don't think that these folks are suffocating to death. Anyway, once the boxcars reach their destination, of course, you can see what happens here from the text. 127 German POWs die from suffocation. Ultimately, again, the story does come out in the New York Times, and I've explained, why that's the case. And there are some subsequent investigations. I haven't read of anybody being held accountable, but SHAEF does take some actions. They actually do put some policies into effect to try to prevent this from occurring again. Once the investigation has been completed.
Good.
All right, so moving on kind of from the negligence, insufficient training example there. Okay, now going on to, or still ETO, and this is an example with the 65th Infantry Division. And we begin to, as we creep closer and closer to what will become the end of our time together, some examples of handling of SS prisoners. Okay, so this is based upon an interview that the War II History Magazine had done with Leon Talper, who was, as you can see here on the slide, was a member of the 65th Infantry Division. And you can also see what he states here, right? So basically stating, hey, we eliminated a lot of SS guides. We had heard about the Normandy massacre. Orders came down, take no prisoners. Lots of Germans lost their lives because of it. For a lousy 85 guys, he lost hundreds because we took no SS prisoners. So this is an interesting, case here, I think, which I alluded to before, where I think this could be an example of what I'm terming as retroactive blanket justification. Right now, I'm not saying that I mean, some of these SS characters, pretty odious and have done some pretty horrible things. But when you're a GI and all these rumors are sort of floating around, you're probably not going to give them the benefit of the doubt to begin with, I think, particularly after Malmedy. Okay. And so they're perhaps using this retroactive justification to help explain why they're carrying out these actions against these SS POWs. Although what I find kind of fascinating here with this particular veteran, this particular example, as I talked about with the 16th Armored Division earlier, the 65th ID, again, one of those very, very late war divisions. They aren't committed to combat until March of 45. So it's interesting that you got a very, very late war division that doesn't even get into combat until about 3.5 months-ish after Malmedy, right? But still, that's being used as justification for how they're going to be handling. So they have no direct connection to Malmedy. They weren't in the Bulge, right? But because they've heard these stories, hey, this is all the rationale that we need to not take the SS as prisoners. So again, it's one of the many justifications or rationales that you might see out there. And as I was also thinking as well, around this time period, because again, 65th, as I mentioned, committed to combat March of 45. I think also there may be some instances as we get into April of 45, where perhaps initially Major General Maurice Rose's death also might have impacted decisions to take POWs, not take POWs, because the way, as you all know, and I think you've done a show about this, Paul. So Maurice Rose killed in action, March 45, vicinity of Paderborn, and the way that the press conveys it initially is he had surrendered and he was gunned down, right? And this is coming out again like New York Times, Stars and Stripes. Yep. So that's the initial reporting. So I could also see examples where, at least in the early days before kind of the story, the narrative gets corrected, where that again is additional sort of rationale or justification to, if you're anywhere in the area and you hear about this story, hey, we're not taking these people prisoner. They're gunning down our general when the guy was willing to surrender, and they shot him down in cold blood. So I think that also can play a role.
And interesting what you said about that unit having had no direct connection to Malmedy, because I'm now remembering I read somewhere, and I don't know where I read it, about, I think it was in the Pacific, units that were joining the fray very late, so they're mopping up on islands. They wanted to be part of the action. There's no actual killing to be done anymore because the enemy are kind of, over. So they're the ones killing prisoners because it's their way of participating in an event that they've missed. So, and I think it was Pacific. It may have been Eastern Front. I don't think it was ETO, but psychologically, it makes some sense. If you're on a unit that's arriving and you've not been part of something and you want to kind of get your hands dirty, I'm using that expression in a weird kind of way, but I can understand the temptation to kill a couple of prisoners just to kind of feel you're part of the club.
And, actually, that's a brilliant comment. And I think that's actually a perfect segue, because I do have two examples. And I know at some point we're going to have to stop, hopefully just for the time being. But yeah, I do have two examples, actually, the 20th Armored Division and the next one we're going to go to on the very next chart. I think that's my take. I think it is part of the motivation for why what happens. Okay, so we'll go ahead and press on here again. We're still on the ETO, and the source I'm using here is William Wharton. Okay, so that's actually his pen name. His real name, given name, was Albert William Duham, which was the name that he would have gone by during War II. So some of you may be familiar with William Wharton. So we had 3 of his books turned into movies. Birdie is one, Dad is another, and the one that I think, because we're in a community here of like-minded individuals, he actually wrote A Midnight Clear. So the movie
one
is
of my favorite films.
Yeah. So the movie is based upon his novel, and I suspect, just a guess here, I suspect that probably when he writes in his memoir about a massacre that occurs, there's a connection between what happens to him personally or what he observes, what he experiences, and what he talks about. I mean, the plot basically that's articulated in the book, and then of course makes it into the movie. So yeah, he is he's a veteran of the 87th Infantry Division. So Battle of the Bulge, kind of last 6-7 months of the war altogether. And the text that I've extracted here comes from his personal memoir of the war. It's called Shrapnel, and came out late in his life. And this actually is, I had floated a theory earlier in one of our previous shows where I think, aside from what we've already looked at an example of, with Jumpy Johnson and Lieutenant Russo, where basically the punishment's handled unofficially, within the unit. This is the first example with William Wharton where I actually have found that the leadership decides to pursue a lower level court-martial for a variety of reasons. And actually the rationale given in the book is kind of interesting, why they don't pursue a general court-martial. They end up going with a special court-martial as well. So I think over time, as we dig into more and more of the records, I think that we'll find that because maybe there was an attempt to keep some of this off the radar, that they didn't want this kind of rising to field army and theater level. Part of it was because, hey, we don't want to throw some guy in prison for life, or pursue the death sentence. We just want to give him 6 months in prison or dox and pay or whatever. They go with special court martials or summary court martials, and I think in the records we're going to see a fairly significant number of these types of instances. So what happens in this particular case? I've kind of given it away what the accountability piece is. Special court martial for murdering POWs. And Paul, again, you've already, I think, cut to the chase in terms of motivation. I think it's an example of very, very late in the war, and it's GIs who basically have kind of haven't gotten their licks in. And so this was one of their last opportunities to do it, to kind of exact revenge and whatever, feel like they were part of the war and part of combat. So they do what they do here. And so, to get into just a little bit of that. So what happens is that Wharton, very, very experienced, combat NCO by this stage. This is very, very late in the war that this happens. And he's put in charge of a patrol in the 87th ID. They would call these Tiger patrols. So he goes out on this Tiger patrol, and they're out to get prisoners, right? There are eight of them all together that are going out on this particular patrol. And what's interesting with this is that this particular Tiger patrol, aside from himself, the remainder of these guys, these GIs, have been in anti-tank units. And so I think that Wharton in his book kind of misstates it a little bit. He talks about anti-tank battalions. I think what he's talking about is the actual anti-tank company that would have been organic to every infantry regiment in the ETO. So what the 87th ID does, because these guys, with this towed anti-tank capability, the 57 millimeters, and as Wharton talks about in his memoir, they just really they're not really seeing much action. It's really not a very good capability to use against Mark IVs or Panthers or King Tigers. It's kind of this little pea shooter. So what ultimately happens is that there's a decision made to begin breaking up some of these AT companies and actually farm them out to the rifle companies. Okay, so this Tiger Patrol is entirely composed, aside from William Wharton, of these anti-tank types that really have not been in sustained combat, with the 87th during the war. Okay, so that should probably already be a cause for some concern. All right, so Wharton goes out with the group. They capture 10 German POWs, waving the flag, drop their weapons and all this. So he is suffering from, I think, what he would call combat fatigue, makes the decision to actually go back by himself without the rest of the patrol. Okay, so he goes off by himself as a patrol leader back to their company, company CP command post, and makes the assumption that these German POWs are going to make it back for interrogation, right? So the Tiger Patrol comes back. He asks the question, where are the prisoners? These 8 anti-tank guys, who are now, of course, riflemen, say, well, so they tried to escape and we shot the bastards, right? And these are guys, in Wharton's words, said that in many cases had never fired a shot in anger prior to this particular patrol. Well, it sounds really fishy to Wharton. It sounds very, very fishy to his company commander as well. And so this is not really the end of it, right? So they begin digging into it, investigating it. And what comes to pass is that the company commander, Wharton, some others go out. They actually do find the remains of all 10 of these German POWs. And at that point, the folks in the Tiger Patrol begin to rat each other out. So basically, what comes out, and I think most of it's in the text here, is that the patrol leader, the guy left in charge when Wharton goes back to the CP, so the patrol leader, and then one of the scouts in the patrol then proceed to torture the 10 POWs. And you can see again in the text, this is right out of his memoir. So they begin by shooting the POWs in the legs, they shoot them in the arms, and then finally administer the coup de grace. And I found this kind of interesting, the last sentence of text there, that it reminds me of Fury. And again, I know there are very strong opinions out there about Fury as well. Okay, so I'll hold my cards close to the vest about what I think about Fury. But the connection is a little bit startling. So he says here verbatim, let's see. One tells how one of the witnesses, one of the Germans, pulled out a wallet with photos of his family and started crying, right? And as basically they're being tortured and then ultimately killed. So yeah, so ultimately there's a special court-martial held. Part of the rationale, which I guess at the time, kind of maybe due to lack of knowledge or access to the information, basically the company commander is told, well, if we pursue a general court-martial, then this is going to go into the congressional record, right? And we don't want the politicians knowing about this. We don't want the Germans to know. We don't want the U.S. public to know. Of course, it's all not true, right? I mean, you can have documents read into the congressional record, but that's not the way that it works. They don't know that at the time, but that's why they pursue arguably a special court-martial versus a general court-martial. And then Wharton concludes by saying that all these individuals, I guess it would be 7 excluding himself, they do all receive hard time for the torture and murder of the German POWs, dishonorable discharges, and all that. And actually, apparently, at some point during the sentencing process, that patrol leader, like the instigator of all this, crosses paths with Wharton. I guess it's during the trial, and basically threatens Wharton and says, "Hey, when I got it out of jail, I'm coming to look for you." So there's a period of time where Wharton is sort of like, "Well, need to look, kind of look over my shoulder because this guy may try to track me down eventually." And apparently he's a psychopath, so he may try to do some horrible things to me and my family. Anyway, he concludes the memoir in talking about this particular massacre, and he says that he wanted to put that part of his life behind him. He said the brutality of it all is sickening, how low human beings can come when you take the leash off of them. I still have something of this feeling in me. I don't have much confidence in my fellow human beings, even 60 years later. And that's his postscript to talking about this particular massacre.
Well, yeah.
Okay, and then let's see. Proceeding on, and I know, Paul, again, we've been going at it for a while. So
is there 5 or 6 more slides? We ought to kind of begin to think about winding things up.
Sure.
But it's been fascinating. But we'll keep on going.
Okay. Well, what I can do, if you'd like, I can wrap it up with ETO. I have a couple of charts for the Mediterranean and North Africa. Really, it's obviously it's your show, it's your call. So you can let me know when you'd like to stop. But until then, proceeding on with a few more examples from the European theater. So actually, this is the slide dedicated to Second Lieutenant Acunto, which you saw much earlier in the presentation. And what I think is really fascinating about this example is it's one of the first that I found where a war crime, and of course pseudonyms are being used and everything, but it's one of the first examples where we find a war crime actually being discussed in popular literature. So the source for this, the gentleman's name was Lester Atwell, and he wrote a book called Private, which comes out in 1958. So he's actually discussing this war crime, maybe a bit surprisingly, back in 1958, right? Again, using the pseudonyms and whatnot. And so to cut to the heart of the matter here, again, this is another, well, just, I'm not saying there's a pattern, but it is another example of the 87th Infantry Division, right? That's the unit that Atwell is with. And so what happens is occurs on the 8th of April, 1945, at a place called Tambach, Germany. And so after a fairly significant firefight, about 30 minutes after that, they're gathering up a number of POWs to begin moving them back again into into to collection points and cages for interrogation and whatnot. So what occurs? What Atwell relates is that, and you can see the text here of basically what occurs. So there's a replacement officer. Again, you've got the pseudonym here. His real name was Acunto. It's not Lieutenant Morse. Lieutenant Acunto basically surveys this stream of prisoners. Again, about 30 minutes after this firefight is concluded, says kind of from out of the blue, let's kill some of these SOBs. Do I get any volunteers? And he certainly does. There are, as Atwell relates, there are 7 enlisted volunteers who are willing to participate in this particular war crime with Acunto. And unfortunately, what also occurs at this time, or maybe better put, doesn't occur, is that there are officers in the area. Okay, so it's not just this replacement officers. There are officers there in the vicinity that watch what's happening, see what Acunto is doing, and do nothing. They do nothing to intervene. They don't stop it. They just kind of, okay, it's this, either this is not happening, I'm pretending it's not happening, whatever. So what Acunto proceeds to do with his 7 fellow perpetrators, they initially haul off, I think it's 10 POWs, murder all them, then come back for a second round, pull out another 8 German POWs, and at least per Atwell, when these 8 see what's happened to their 10 colleagues, they try to make a run for it, and of course they get gunned down as well. So ultimately, there are roughly somewhere around 20 German POWs that are going to be murdered there in the vicinity of Tambach. So actually, this does proceed to a court-martial, but for better or for worse, Acunto is the only individual who does go to court-martial. None of the other perpetrators are held accountable, at least not through the military justice process. But ultimately, Acunto is acquitted. So basically, I guess at the end of the day, there is no accountability for what occurs here. So, and I don't want to jump to conclusions, but one thing that I am seeing, one pattern that perhaps is forming, and some of you may have seen a little bit of this on that murder chart, with the graphics and whatnot, where it does seem like, again, not wanting to jump to conclusions, but it does seem like there's more of a willingness to prosecute enlisted men and NCOs for these war crimes. And I think every example I've found so far, the officer gets acquitted, like every single time. So, like I said, there are not a lot that I've found, but the ones that I have found, so we'll see. Like ultimately, if there's anything to that, but it is interesting that it tends to be the lower ranks that are if anybody's getting prosecuted, it's them, and not so much the officers.
And you could make the argument that that's maybe more the deterrent angle, is that there's more enlisted men in the army, so they're, by convicting an enlisted man, they're reaching a wider audience of don't do this again, folks, compared to others. Or you can look at it as Colin's watching this, class prejudice, or there's. I think ultimately, as you said there, this is a subject that will need younger people, not that we're old, but to go and take this on and work on this in more detail, because there aren't that many cases. So whether you can make any kind of broad statements from the relatively few cases we have that there is a particular set of, as we said earlier, criteria or things, I don't know. But I don't want to make these assumptions that if you're an officer and you're white, you're much less likely to get convicted than if you're another rank or black. But we're kind of making some of those assumptions, aren't we?
Well, and I'm like you. I'd prefer to let the evidence sort of bear out and help us reach conclusions. But yeah, that's what I'm seeing so far. And then of course, not to go kind of down the rabbit trail, but it certainly does get into issues of command responsibility. And of course, that's basically the rationale that's used with General Yamashita, right, in the Philippines. So it's all about command responsibility, and he gets executed. I mean, it's like, hey, you were in charge in Manila, and these things, whether you wanted them to happen or not, they happened under your command. So guess what? You're going to be executed. Same thing with Nuremberg, right? Where you can't just say, oh, well, I was just following orders. I mean, there is some accountability for, or should be, perhaps for leaders as well. One last thing to say about Acunto during his actual trial, part of the justification he uses for doing what he did, he says that Patton had given a speech to his unit in which he was rumored to have told them not to line any prisoners up against the wall and shoot them, he said, "Shoot the bastards before they get to the wall." So I don't know, kind of another interesting kind of through line in a lot of this is that, I don't know, like for better or worse, but not trying to be presumptuous, but Patton seems to pop up sort of again and again, like, Biscari Massacre, Chino Massacre. Oh, like my justification for conducting this war crime is Patton said this or Patton said that. So,
which comes
anyway.
down to this idea we said earlier, Mark, about the particular style of, in this case, it's a general officer, but platoon commanders, just the way they talk, because that line by Patton, they kill them before they get to the wall. You could interpret that as don't allow them to be taken, but you could just say do it in combat. There's ways of interpreting that, but it comes from a particular style of language. And when we talked about Howard Jumpy Johnson earlier, he had a particular style of language. It was very, I remember his D-Day speech, "I will plunge my knife in the heart of the foulest, blackest, hardest German," or something like that. Whereas other people were giving different kind of speeches. I'm thinking of the guy of 3rd Battalion 506, Wolverton, who was maybe offering a prayer. Different types of leader instill a different spirit in their speeches and words to their troops, and it's interesting that this guy is specifically referencing a speech by Patton that was there to motivate as a reason for why he did this. It's, again, I don't know what the conclusions we can draw from it are, but it's just really interesting.
Yeah, and what I think is a bit intriguing when it comes to Patton and perhaps the language that he was using and how he was imparting his vision and in command, climate, and culture within his various units is the fact that actually, and again, we'll see. I'm not sure that we'll get to Biscari today. That may be for a different time. There are 1 or 2 ETO slides that are left. But in the Biscari massacres, when Sergeant Horace West is put on trial for one massacre near Biscari on Sicily, and then Captain Compton is put on trial for another massacre, again, same vicinity. They're both in the same infantry regiment, both on Sicily. But the fascinating thing is that they both use a speech Patton had given before the landings on Sicily as the rationale for why they then proceeded to kill primarily Italian POWs. There are a few Germans as well. And, oh, by the way, Patton was investigated for it. So you would think, right, that given he's kind of had this close call where he's had subordinates basically trying to use his language, in a trial to justify a war crime, and he was investigated for it, that maybe he might try to somewhat, and of course, we're all familiar with his personality, but, maybe you try to tailor or calibrate a little bit of your speech accordingly.
I think asking people like Patton and MacArthur or anyone else to kind of change their style midway through a war, I think is not going to work. But the use of language is really fascinating, and that speech again by Patton, because I'm going off on a tangent now. We ought to not do that, but there was that famous crime in Britain. I think it was in 1950 or something, where a policeman was shot by a young man who had, a history of kind of mental illness and was, mentally disabled. And he shot a policeman. But the guy he was with said, "Let him have it." And there was a film made about it called "Let Him Have It." Christopher Eccleston was a star in it. And to this day, they're debating whether "let him have it" meant give the policeman the firearm, or "let him have it" mean let him have it, kill the policeman. They're still debating what was meant by those 4 words. And it's fascinating how the tone of 4 words can completely change the meaning of what those 4 words mean. And I can understand, again, if you're the kind of person who hears Patton's speech and you're already a bit maybe violent, psychopath, whatever, you're hearing something in those words that the other thousands of people there aren't hearing because of just the way you're interpreting, or slight difference of the tone of voice said, like the going back to famous the order that may or may not have been given to not take prisoners. Even the tone of voice in which that was said by certain people could leave it open to interpretation as what is meant by that. There's too many variables, I think, to this whole thing to make really strong conclusions. But it is fascinating how much language and motivation of speeches comes into it. Anyway, let's skip through a few more.
Yeah.
And
okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah, brilliant
And,
stuff. So
and,
Dachau now.
yeah, and I think we do have, if we go through maybe 2-3 more slides, if that works for you, it's kind of a nice,
Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah.
natural stopping point. Yeah. So actually, I think to try to get to a couple of examples, I won't say too much about this because I would suspect that of probably the 2 or 3 sort of best known, and forgive me, like when I say like war crime or atrocity, I mean, like the Dachau massacre is a war crime within a massive war crime. So I don't know, it's a little bit difficult and kind of in this particular context to talk about war crimes we were committing sort of when the larger context of the Holocaust. But again, many of you, I think, were already familiar with the Dachau massacre, 29 April 1945. You may have seen Shutter Island with Leo DiCaprio, where this actually is, of course, it's Martin Scorsese's kind of artistic interpretation of what happens in The Liberator, which was, I think, came out, was it last year before, about Felix Sparks, who was a commander in the 45th ID. Yeah, so this also is covered in there as well. So, yeah, I mean, without getting too much into it, but essentially this particular company, it's Item Company 157th Infantry, 45th ID. They first come across these box cars that are literally filled with thousands of corpses, and you can imagine what that would do to you. I mean, even if you've been sort of desensitized, to I mean, just horrific, kind of activities and things that happen in combat. But even this was too much, for lots of these GIs. So once they make their way into the camp, again, just kind of cutting to the chase, there are a couple of different incidents. The estimates are that somewhere between about 30 to 50 SS were killed. Of course, there's this ongoing debate. How many of those were actually in the medical facility? How many were actually concentration camp guards and all that? Probably will never be solved, quite honestly. But there are a couple of different incidents. The one probably most famous, and you can see it in the upper left-hand corner there, is I want to say it's 17. Yeah, 17 altogether that are killed in the coal yard there at Dachau. And then, kind of famously, Felix Sparks, as a battalion commander, does intervene. Literally physically kicks like one of these guys off of a 30 caliber machine gun to get him to stop it. Of course, at that point, the damage has already been done to an extent. So that does happen. And then, so there will be an investigation that's going to take place as the war is concluding. Oddly enough, Patton sort of enters the room, enters the picture again. So he becomes appointed the military governor in Bavaria, and there are discussions about whether or not we actually want to pursue court-martial against Sparks. So there's also a medical officer as well, the company commander, a few others as well. Are we going to pursue court-martials? And Pat makes the decision to dismiss the charges. That basically, if there is ever a case, of a war crime where perhaps we need to take putting it lightly, extenuating circumstances into account, in terms of why someone might make the decision to commit a war crime, this would be it, right? When you're confronted with something just as horrific as this. And Paul, if I ever do and get invited back, I've got another presentation I do on Holocaust liberation narratives. What is kind of fascinating about this, I think, is how restrained actually. I mean, of course, we're never going to know the full story, but from what I've been able to gather, it's actually interesting how restrained a lot of these GIs actually were when they were entering these camps. And oftentimes, what I find is that, there'll be inmates that are asking for weapons and this kind of thing, like help us kill these guys, whatever. So what oftentimes ends up happening, what I found kind of anecdotally, is that the inmates are basically just allowed to kind of do what they feel like they got to do. So it's beating up a capo or drowning some concentration camp guards. So the GIs sort of stand back and they let it happen to an extent, right? But they aren't literally the ones that are in there pulling the trigger in most cases. And I just can't even begin to imagine the amount of restraint that it would take, right, in a particular situation, not to want to execute some of these individuals. But anyway, so that's the Dachau massacre, and perhaps just looking at maybe two more slides here. So this is the Lieutenant Colonel Callahan example. I think this is another one like the William Wharton story with the former anti-tank personnel, where you've got 20th Armored Division. They are with the 6th, 16th. They're the last 2 armored divisions committed to combat in the ETO, like last couple of weeks, basically, of the of the war. And so I think, again, here, this may be an example of, hey, we got into the war late, and that might be part of the motivation for this. So kind of like late war unit, vengeance. Maybe some of this is convenience. I think also in this, because, of course, we liberate the first subcamp of Buchenwald on the 4th of April, 45, Ordruff. So that basically is just sort of blanketing, I think, everything in that last month or so of the war, right? And it's unavoidable. And again, entering into the calculus about whether or not you're going to take, particularly SS, as prisoners or not. So, yeah, here we are. It's into the war, 9 May 45. And so Arthur Callahan, Lieutenant Colonel, one of the commanders within the 20th Armored Division, and as the slide reflects, so he gathers at least his officers together and states that he has verbal orders from higher headquarters. They don't put these things into writing, but these SS men have been getting. I don't want them brought in. I don't want them brought in. Take them down a small road and shoot them. They ran, and so I think that it is the case. Where perhaps that there are orders that are communicated. Not any surprise that oftentimes it's going to be done verbally. We're not going to sort of codify this or capture it in an official operations order or something along those lines. So that's how it's communicated to his subordinates. So ultimately, what happens once he passes instructions down to his subordinates, gives instructions that the SS men captured will be taken down a road and shot. There will be 21 Americans altogether who will gather a total of 10 prisoners based on those instructions and kill those 10 prisoners. So when it goes to a court martial, the judge advocates for the unit conclude that Callahan himself, the lieutenant colonel, and then the 3 lieutenants that are carrying this out, that they're all going to face some accountability. But then the 17 remaining, the vast majority who are the shooters, like we saw with Acunto and some others, they're not going to be prosecuted. It's just going to be the officers. So eventually, charges are dropped against the 3 lieutenants. So it's only Callahan at that point. He's still on the hot seat, undergoing the court martial. But again, for whatever reason, and I got a colleague who actually has the court martial file that I need to actually look at to get into some more of the particulars. But ultimately, Callahan is tried and acquitted, not of murder, but of conduct that is prejudicial to good order and discipline. So not actually put on trial for murder or manslaughter. And ultimately, he is acquitted. So kind of walks away from this, for better or worse. And that's the way things lie, and end up with Arthur Callahan. And if I may also on this, just in terms of verbal versus written orders, there is, and I promise after this one, Paul, I'll just maybe look at one last slide, and then if you'd like, we can call it an afternoon or an evening. This dichotomy between verbal and written orders, there actually is an example of written orders. So when you go into the Army's official history for the Battle of the Bulge, the language they use is really interesting. In fact, let me see if I actually have it here. Of course, I mean they're writing this in the 50s and 60s, right? I'm not putting my eyeballs on it at the moment, but basically the official history for the Battle of the Bulge does indicate that there was one regiment. It's the 328th Infantry Regiment out of the 26th ID, the Yankee Division. So there is one regimental commander who, well, I won't put my editorial spin on this, who actually does issue an order. It's a fragmentary order. He issues it on the 21st of December 44. For the attack the next day, where he says no SS troops or paratroopers will be taken. No SS troops or paratroopers will be taken prisoners, but will be shot on sight. So I don't know if there's a cause and effect here, but I will say that particular regimental commander changed command 5 days later. So I can't, I won't say that necessarily it's connected to this order, the written versus the verbal order, but he is not left in regimental command for much longer after this order is issued. Now, having said that, in the Battle of the Bulge, the official, history, it's the Green Books, right? It's one of the Green Books I'm talking about here. It actually does go on to say that, oh yes, although there's this example, this fragmentary order issued, and yes, there probably were some leaders that were telling subordinates not to take prisoners. We don't have any evidence that anyone sort of took this into their own hands and actually did not take SS prisoners. So it's maybe you can kind of chalk that up to the time period where it was at that point where, because the veterans weren't really talking about this kind of thing at that point, so they didn't really have the evidence to say that yeah, well, we knew it was happening. And as word got out about Malmedy, there were lots of units that were not taking particularly SS prisoners for some period of time, after 17 December 44. But yeah, so interesting how the official history addresses this particular issue, taking prisoners versus not taking prisoners in the Battle of the Bulge, and how official history, right, handles these particular instances versus how those of us who try to go back and do the research unofficially begin to discover perhaps countervailing or oppositional evidence to what the official record says. So, and then Paul, I know. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'll just say it's not just the fact that we've got the people watching today. It's always the fact that when people see very long shows listed, they don't necessarily always want to dive in and watch them later. So I want to kind of bring it to an end. Not that you're not brilliant, but just we can spit it down and just so that we get more views on this, because I want people to watch it. So yeah, we'll just deal with this, and then perhaps a couple of last conclusions, and then we'll bring you back. That's a simple answer is to bring you back.
Okay. So let's just avoid the Mediterranean, North African theaters. And the last slide I would like to go to, if you don't mind, is it's titled "Public Morality," and it's a New York Times article from 1 April 1971. And that'll be there. It is. There it is. Okay. Yeah. So this to me is also intriguing, and it is tied to a couple of different wars. This is tied to both World War II and Vietnam. And the article specifically is about Lieutenant William Calley's conviction. Many of you probably know who I'm talking about. He was the platoon leader in command at My Lai on 16 March 1968, where between 347 and 504 unarmed men, women, children, and infants were killed in cold blood, and some of them were also raped. So anyway, yeah, one of the most horrific atrocities in U.S. military history by far. So anyway, this particular New York Times article is talking about the conviction itself. Calley ultimately is the only perpetrator who is actually put on trial and actually convicted, if you can believe that. Nobody else in the platoon ultimately is convicted. It's just Calley. Okay, so the article here is talking about that conviction. He originally is given a life sentence, but then ultimately, again, as many of you know, he will just serve merely 3.5 years under house arrest, and then he is also in turn released. So the public reaction is, I think, maybe somewhat counterintuitive, and the article speaks to that, where you can see after Calley is convicted, 5,000 telegrams reach the White House, 100 to 1 in favor of clemency. There's another poll that is done that the Times talks about a few days later, where 24% of those polled agreed that Calley was actually guilty. The rest apparently don't. Many of them think that he basically is being used as a scapegoat. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just being a little bit too optimistic, but the reaction, I think, is what I would consider to be really counterintuitive, that there are thousands of Americans that don't really want him to be held to account for, again, one of the worst atrocities in our history. Anyway, let's bring it back to War II. So you got the article and you got the public reaction to it. And I've had to cut off the article. It was actually longer than this in terms of the actual length there, right? The text, but the actual size. So yeah, the last piece I would share is that in this article, they actually include the reactions of some Korean War veterans and some World War II veterans as well to Calley's conviction. Okay, and that's where Raymond Huff comes into the picture. And this is the last thing. Maybe this is a good way to end up in a little bit provocative, something to think about. So Major General Raymond Huff, okay, he had been a battalion commander in the 1st Special Service Force in War II. Later on, once they're disestablished, he moves over to the 45th Infantry Division, and beyond that becomes the youngest adjutant general in Louisiana history. So he serves 2 tenures as the adjutant general of the Louisiana National Guard. So quite a storied and prominent, military career, retires as a 2-star. So here he is in 1971, and the viewers can, again, reach their own conclusions about this. Here he is in 1971, and Raymond Huff's reaction to Calley's conviction is, he says, he issued a no prisoners order during World War II. We shot everything that moved, he recalled. If the Germans had won, I would have been on trial at Nuremberg instead of them. And then he called the Calley-My court-martial verdict a damn shame. So I guess maybe something to leave with the viewers, and Paul, with you, would be, what would be Huff's motivation for doing this? What would make him want to come forward to defend Calley in arguably one of the most prominent newspapers, certainly in the U.S., if not the world? Was he not concerned about risks to his reputation? Retired, highly decorated Major General, not concerned about his reputation. And then finally, does he believe that the public that's actually reading this article isn't going to care about what he did in War II? That basically it's on the same sort of moral plane with Calley, that, hey, this stuff happens in war, and Calley shouldn't be convicted. I wasn't convicted. Maybe I would have been if we'd had a Nuremberg-like trial, for the Allies, but I wasn't, and this is what I did. So yeah, just
to add a bit of, he was a Distinguished Service Cross recipient, Huff. So he'd go in the he only lived 6 months beyond this quote. He died in 1972. So wow. Maybe he was very ill, knew he didn't have much long to live, and was maybe a bit more open about speaking than I don't know. I just threw that in there because I was looking him up while we were talking about it. But what's interesting is that quote is used a lot. That comes up on YouTube a lot by the whataboutery people when they're talking about when it's a show about Axis war crimes, and they say, what about Allied war crimes? That quote there, if the Germans had won, I'd be on trial at Nuremberg instead of them, is one of the ones that the whatabouters, have that one memorized. That's one of the ones they always put in there. So it's left us a legacy of that.
Oh my goodness!
That is used as a. I've seen that. Brad maybe can confirm that one has been. Often it's quoted without it necessarily naming the person who said it, but it that one does the rounds a lot. So it's left a legacy.
Yeah, and what a note to end the chat with today. To end on this particular high note, but yeah, certainly not an attempt at whataboutery, but I think again, it really stimulates perhaps, I think, some interesting questions. Again, if you put yourself in his shoes, what do you have to gain basically by going into this newspaper and saying that, right? I mean, obviously you've got some supporters, because you can see thousands of supporters are in basically Calley's corner in terms of how prosecution or lack thereof from Eli should be handled. But just like, what sort of thought process do you go through to it's something you probably have kept to yourself, or perhaps your military colleagues for decades, and you're just going to throw it all out there.
It's that type of people are going to be okay with it, though, that for all the people who are going to hate it, you're going to get an equal number who are going to love it. It's that true. Like that kind of comment when people talk about Patton saying we defeated the wrong enemy, or let's go and take out the Russians or Soviet Union, which weirdly topical right now. For as many people who find that a distasteful comment, there's an equal number who think it was a great comment. So I suppose that kind of statement is one that a lot of people would have been in agreement with him, and a lot of people would have found it despicable as well. But someone said in the sidebar there, that kind of just supporting a brother officer aspect. But it is interesting that he died 6 months later. So maybe I don't know. There's lots of things that you could speculate as to why he was prepared to say that. And also lots of reasons why other people didn't say anything. Maybe there were other commanders who read that and said, well, I agree with him, but I'm definitely not going to go out and speak to my newspaper and say something similar. Again, right at the beginning, you said how you're using the data we have, but there's lots of information that we don't have. So we're not drawing false conclusions as such, but we have a small data sect example to use to draw these conclusions. So if you were to poll in 1970 or 71 every ex-officer in the U.S. Army how they felt about that case. I wonder what the statistics would have been for those who had responded to it. Coming out of beginning Vietnam's winding down, public opinion against it. The timing of it is interesting as well, isn't it? Would you get a different response in 1971 from 1961 or 1981 or 2001? Lots of things to think about. Lots of variables.
Yeah, and we didn't go into the polls. Probably say that for a different show if I'm lucky enough to be invited back.
Oh, you will be. Don't worry.
But I think that a corollary to that is polling on the atomic bomb, right? So we're not going to do this. I mean, we maybe look at it on for a different show, but yeah, I mean the polling that was done for the atomic bomb, I want to say it was in September of '45, and the polling is done amongst. The sample size includes U.S., Canadians, and Brits, if I recall correctly. But the approval for dropping the bomb is somewhere in like the 75-76% range really at the war. But then if you look at those polls, you can look at polls that are done in the 60s, you can 90s today, and you can see over time that those approval numbers for dropping the bombs, they decrease. And I think maybe it's now maybe in the 40s or 50s, something like that. So yeah, I mean, people's generations sort of perceptions change, sort of like moral and ethical perspectives, and what was acceptable at one time and what isn't now, and living it at the time, and how that bears upon sort of your perspectives on dropping the bomb as an example. So I think it's a great, again, kind of correlated to what you're talking about, and perhaps these war crimes might have been considered more acceptable to many of us counterparts at the time, or in maybe a preceding generation versus how we view it today. So
and even a simple thing like the number of people in the 70s who would have had a relative who was killed, wounded, or suffering from PTSD from World War II. Whereas if you polled people now, there's another generation or two away from World War II. There's less direct connection with it. It's the same thing might apply to if you polled people in 1945 about what should have happened to guards at concentration camps, you'd get a different response in 45 than you perhaps, and depending on where you were asking the question and to whom you were asking the question. So these examples of what polls say, as you said there earlier, the statistics you can prove anything with statistics. You can prove anything with polls, depending on where you ask them and who you ask them, and indeed exactly how you word the question as well. That's often the one when they look at these things about the bomb now, is often when they word the question, they don't mention anything about they don't give the option of would dropping the bomb, do you think dropping the bomb was a more preferable solution than invading over land? They will just say, was it right or wrong? And so depending on how you ask the question, you're getting a type of answer that the interviewer wants to get from that. I'm losing my thread now, but I know what I mean. And but I think we'll just bring things to an end and then have you back and discuss some of this again. I think it's actually this last 15 minutes or so has given me a food for thought of how we can perhaps take this forward and maybe try and draw some conclusions if you're happy to come back.
No, sounds great. I'd be happy to. And can I put in one shameless plug before you
please do.
Before you cut me off? Because I think as we talk about sort of again shifting interpretations, perceptions of the Second World War, if I may, and I don't think that you would consider them to be a competitor. Maybe this is going to get edited out of the video. We'll see. But I just and many of you actually may have participated in the National War Team Museum's Memory Wars Conference. That took place. It was it Thursday through Saturday, and just really fascinating. The discussions that are taking place now amongst professional scholars, academics that have been studying this for decades, and the shifting interpretations and things that we thought were settled about the Second World War. It's it's complicated and it's nuanced and it's gray. It's not black and white. It's not simplistic. How do we interpret going forward? Museum exhibits, all this, write books. So it's just a never ending situation. In terms of how the war is
history and its interpretation is never static. It's never the history itself is written in pencil, not pen, and the interpretation of it is constantly changing as we move through different eras. I'm talking today with a guest who's going to be on after the break about the Eastern Front, and he's from Ukraine, and he said that the presentation I will be giving now will be completely different to a presentation I would give 6 months ago. Not because the history has changed, just simply because, as a Ukrainian, his attitude to the Russians and Soviet Union has just shifted a bit. So it's just the raw data he's dealing with is going to be the same. The battles will have unfolded the same way, but his handling and interpretation and explanations about it will obviously have changed, because sympathies and allegiances and trends are changing all the time. But anyway, we're going off down another rabbit hole when we said we wouldn't do anymore. So
yes,
Mark, we'll just end this now, and I'll bring you back and have you again to do some kind of roundup discussion where we draw some conclusions. So
be an honor and a privilege.
Brilliant. Well, it's been great, folks. So as I said, I'm taking a break for a few days, back on April the 8th with a show about with Kevin Mara about his new book, which will be fantastic. So enjoy yourselves when I'm not broadcasting, but keep watching. Perhaps go back through the old back catalogue and watch some of the older shows if you're new to World War II TV. But right now, I'm going to say thank you very much for Mark for sharing his knowledge with us. Thank you very much to the viewers for sticking with us, and I will see you all next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.